those shares right now up 141%. Bitcoin also pushing above 100,000 for the first time in 2 weeks. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Alex.
All right, thanks so much, John Tucker. Alex Steele here alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news in business, economics, and finance through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence folks. They cover 2,000 companies and 130 industries all around the world. We also tap our great experts outside of Bloomberg for their take on the market. And we go to one now. Shana Sissel is president and CEO of Benrion Capital Management, and she joins us. So usually January is like one of the best months for inflows, right? Like, do we buy the January effect here?
I don't know if I buy the January effect this year. We also normally get a Santa Claus rally that we didn't get this year either. So I think we have a new administration coming in. There's some uncertainty there. But overall positives for the markets. Inflation, though, remains a headwind. The Fed is more hawkish than they were. So there's certainly some things to be concerned about. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't put money into the market. I'd just be really selective on where I do put money in the market.
So, Shana, Bloomberg News, MLive is out with a survey we do with a third party. People are still buying this Trump trade. I mean, 61% of the respondents feel like risk assets are going to move higher. Is that what you're still hearing from your clients? Is there still that type of trade out there?
Well, I think it's more of a mindset of the last, 15 years, if you think about it. I think we are largely more optimistic because there's an entire generation of investors that don't know what it's like to have a flat to down to volatile market. And there's an expectation that what we've been seeing, which is double-digit returns on average since the financial crisis bottomed. And that, I think, is kind of coloring the expectations of the average investor. I do think that overall the Trump trade is positive for equities, but I do think we need to temper our expectations in the fact that 20% plus returns of the S&P 500 for multiple years is not normal, and there is going to be a return to normalcy at some point. When that is, I don't know, but there are certainly reasons to think that 2025 could be the year we return to normalcy and, God forbid, get 8 to 10% returns on the S&P 500.
Right. It's like normalcy, but it's not like you're getting negative return or anything. What's interesting is that Fed official Lisa Cook said that AI and private credit are among financial stability risks. That was in a speech earlier this morning. That kind of touches on your area of expertise, right? The alternative landscape. What do you think about that kind of sentence?
Well, AI, I think, is interesting that was thrown in there because that doesn't necessarily impact the capital markets per se. I think it's more the whole, trends around it and all of the FOMO that goes into wanting to be involved with the AI trade. But it's not necessarily specific to how the structure of capital markets work, but private credit is. And I think that's an interesting comment. If you think about the explosion of private credit, it happened during and after the financial crisis as traditional banks became less able and less willing to provide capital to small businesses, to lower credit, that kind of thing. And there was this need for this secondary non-bank financial lending market, which is where private credit kind of exploded. It's always existed, but that's where it really became a much bigger part of overall capital market structure. And the same risks that existed prior to that in terms of lower quality lending, lending to non-traditional types of businesses, things of that nature, those risks still exist, right? And AI is part of that. Crypto is part of that. And when I mean AI and crypto, I don't necessarily mean actual crypto and AI as an investment, but companies related to that, ancillary, that need capital. And so I do think that private credit, because so much money has rushed into it, that tends to push folks to make loans and to provide capital at a higher risk. And so I can see why she would have mentioned private credit.
So CES kicks off in earnest tomorrow out in Las Vegas. And we heard from Dan Ives of Wedbush Securities this morning that, once again, AI is going to be front and center. From your perspective on the alternatives front, Do you feel like there's a lot more to go with this AI story? It feels like it's a long-term trend, not a short-term issue at all.
Oh, I agree. It is a long-term trend. But what happens when we have these long-term trends? And let's think about, like, I know it feels like AI has been all we've talked about for a really long time, but let's think about what the last hottest trend was, where all the money, especially in the private markets like venture capital and private equity, was just throwing money at anything that had the word blockchain or crypto in it. And what happens is all the money runs, and there's people who probably shouldn't have gotten capital, did not have great business models or business plans, but because they had those two really, really important buzzwords in their pitch decks, they were able to capture assets and capital as a result. And then what happens is you find out who the winners and losers are going to be, and there's always things that blow up on you. And I think AI is kind of in that trend right now. And as we get a little bit further into the AI, development, you will see similar things happen there, because so much money ran into it. All the VCs wanted to have anything and anything that had AI associated with it. And there are going to be things that not just don't work, but blow up in spectacular fashion as a result. So I think AI as a trend is a big deal, just like when we had the tech bubble, the same thing. It was a game-changing type of technology, type of trend. But as a result, a lot of money runs after it and goes into bad things.
Shana, always good to get your perspective. Thank you so much. Happy New Year. Shana Sissel, President and CEO of Benrion Capital Management, joining us. So we have a great thing here at Bloomberg called MLive. They sort of document what's happening in the market as it happens with real analysis, right? They're not just like Bitcoin's going up 10%. Like, they give you real analysis, and a lot of these guys have worked on the street as well. It's a great feature, and you should check it out, MLive. Now, they also did a nice pulse survey, and they took a look at what investors are expecting for this year and what those in MLive are expecting. Christina Kino is Bloomberg Managing Editor for Markets Live, and she joined us now on this. So what were some of the findings that you guys had when you went through the survey for what to expect for this year?
Well, Alex, I think there was a really big theme of U.S. exceptionalism. That really was what stood out to some of the responses that we got from our survey participants. I mean, this is a broad survey, right? We asked them about stocks, their view on the dollar, their view on treasuries, and really the overwhelming answer is this expectation for U.S. growth that will outpace the rest of the world, and therefore that's another reason to expect stocks to keep getting higher, for the dollar to keep rising, and for treasury yields to be doing the same.
So this kind of goes to the Trump trade, which I guess we've come to mean long the U.S. dollar, long risk assets and things like that. But I'm surprised, by year end, 61% of the 553 respondents said the S&P 500 will be higher due to the strong dollar. So that sounds pretty solid, pretty pro-growth. What else jumped out at you here that kind of surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, that was really interesting, especially because, you would think that a strong dollar would at some point kind of raise caution about how far stocks would go, right? But the dollar view is pretty interesting too, Paul, because, 51% of the respondents did say that the dollar was going to keep getting higher, primarily because of trade policy, tariffs in particular. But then there's also a sizable proportion of that respondent group, 27%, that said that tariffs are actually a reason for the dollar to fall. And so that's really interesting, because I think there is definitely this kind of double-edged sword nature of trade policy in the U.S. At some point, yes, tariffs, in the short term, definitely expected to boost the dollar. We saw that today with a reaction to the Washington Post report that tariffs were going to be narrower, presumably, and then Trump pushing back. You saw the dollar reversing those losses. And you can see kind of like the reaction function in markets. But ultimately, I think some of these respondents are thinking longer term, tariffs might be negative for the U.S. economy. Ultimately, it's going to come back to bite, and that's going to be bad for the dollar.
Well, that's the thing. When you say that a lot of the respondents, the overwhelming respondents, think that U.S. exceptionalism will reign, that makes me nervous, because that feels one-sided at the end of the day, which means that something like tariffs or surprise tariff of any extent can really upend the apple cart.
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. I mean, as we know, a lot of these things very dangerous when it gets to that point where every everyone is thinking the same thing, right? I mean, that definitely makes positioning vulnerable to any sort of volatility. And if we know anything from the first Trump administration, it will definitely be fraught with a lot of volatility. So something for investors to consider in 2025.
So is the expectation, it feels like markets this year, particularly the stock market, is going to be even more earnings driven than maybe the last several years when we had the Fed cutting rates, and that was kind of the narrative here. The market participants you talked to, are they comfortable with that scenario, that earnings can in fact come through and drive the markets higher?
Yeah, Paul. I mean, a lot of the answers that we've gotten from the survey definitely pointing to the exceptionalism, not just in U.S. growth, but also in U.S. earnings. And again, I think this raises a lot of skepticism in some corners that how much further can it go? But I think when you look at it from a global perspective, there really is not a lot of alternatives out there, right? When it comes to the returns that you could get from the U.S. tech sector versus, I don't know, European large caps, for instance. Like, it really is not really that much of a comparison. And so you can understand why investors, even though it's looking a little bit long in the tooth, still prefer to be in the U.S. assets.
So Scott Rebner over at Goldman Sachs is a great technician. He does tactical investing. He covers the fund flows and stuff like that. And he just had a note out, and he said that right now investors have FOMO, fear of materially underperforming benchmarks, and that forget FOMO. So FOMO.
Gotcha.
Scott, there's your shout out. All right, thanks a lot, Christina. Appreciate it. Christina Kino joining us. She heads up our Markets Live coverage. Again, check it out, MLive Pulse, and you can check out MLive Go. It's a great asset. You can look at it all throughout the day. So apparently, there's more political turmoil this time in Canada.
Yeah,
that was a bad
I see
accent.
what you're doing.
That was a bad accent. You got there. Yes, John Tucker?
They're just setting up outside the Prime Minister's
Yep.
house.
Oh, is that the Prime
10:45. Yep, we're about 10 minutes away from Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, making a statement. We don't know what that will be. The reporting, though, is that he will step down as party leader, not as Prime Minister. We're going to go to Ottawa and break that all down with Laura Kane, Ottawa Bureau Chief. She'll be joining us next. Political turmoil all over the world continues to reign. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. The S&P 500 on track for a second straight gain after 5 straight losses. NVIDIA and the other tech stocks driving Wall Street higher today. You have Uber, those shares right now, they're driving up 3.4% after the ride-hailing app said it would accelerate $1.5 billion in purchases of its own stock, but part of actually a previously announced $7 billion buyback program. And as we move into 2025, Seema Shah at Principal Global Investors says inflation is chief among her concerns.
You know, if inflation is going to increase and the Fed has to actually pivot to rate hikes, it's definitely not our scenario. But if that were to happen, we just saw the way that the market reacted after Powell's fairly hawkish speech at the last FOMC decision to see how markets responded. So I think that would be a fairly meaningful concern.
And the yield on the long bond, let's start there. 30-year yield right now, 4 basis points higher. That is at 4.85. The 10's up 3 basis points, 4.63, and the 2-year unchanged. That's at 4.28 right now. This upcoming week, one fewer trading day than usual. The stock exchange NASDAQ going to close their stock and options markets Thursday. This is the National Day of Mourning for former President Carter. Friday, that's going to bring the week's big headliner, the monthly jobs report. And then we did have some revised government data this morning pointing to a larger decline in durable goods orders, and the primary issue there, a big drop in aviation. S&P 500, 65 points higher. That's up 1.1%. We're at 6,007. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 225 points. The NASDAQ 100 up 349 points. Yeah, that is a rise of 1.6%. We check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Alex.
All right. Thanks so much, John Tucker. Alex Steele here alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We're broadcasting to you live from our Interactive Broker studio right here in Midtown Manhattan. You can also check us out on YouTube as well. All eyes right now in Ottawa. Justin Trudeau's office scheduled an announcement for 10:45 a.m. We have a live shot right now that we are looking at, podium, a teleprompter. No one's there yet, but the expectation due to reporting is that he'll resign as party leader. He does keep his job as prime minister until a new party leader is decided upon. Let's get some more on this with Laura Kane, Ottawa Bureau Chief. She joins us now. Laura, can you just help us understand how we got to this moment?
Well, the pressure has been mounting on Trudeau to resign really since the middle of 2023 as his party started to decline in the polls as cost of living concerns really swamped it. Inflation, interest rates, and the drastic run-up in house prices post-pandemic really started to hurt his Liberal Party. But the calls grew this past summer when the Liberals lost seats that were thought safe in special elections in Toronto and Montreal. And then he managed to stave off this sort of caucus revolt that seemed to be brewing among Liberal lawmakers right up until mid-December, when his finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, really dropped a bomb, declaring that, announcing her resignation and declaring that he had wasted his time with costly political gimmicks instead of keeping the fiscal powder dry in preparation for a Trump presidency. So this was seen as really an unavoidable blow that would lead to his resignation at that point. Even so, he waited out the holiday period. He spent some time reflecting on his future, and he really didn't make the decision, it seems, until recently. And now today, in just a few moments, we expect him to announce that he is resigning, as you said, staying on as PM until a new leader can be selected.
Will the new leader come from the Liberal Party? And if so, does that mean the policies may not change much? How does this work out?
I think if you look ahead, I think the policies have to change because Canadians have changed, right? His downfall was largely engendered by his inattention to economic matters. He focused on massively expanding the social safety net, but he didn't, one might argue, pay sufficient attention to expanding the economy. And that is what voters are really feeling at this point. And so I think even regardless of who wins the leadership race, whether it is a Liberal MP such as Chrystia Freeland herself or an outsider, Mark Carney, the chair of Brookfield Asset Management, has been suggested as an alternative and is, ramping up to run in the leadership race if it's open to him. Regardless of who wins, I think you will see a much keener focus on economic issues. While they won't step away from their sort of liberal, socially progressive roots, Canadians want to see a heightened focus on the economy. And so I do think even though, you will see a Liberal interim prime minister come into effect, the policies will have to change somewhat. And then, of course, the opposition parties in Parliament have said they plan to bring down the government at their first opportunity. So we've heard that Trudeau has requested kind of a suspension of Parliament, which will allow for a leadership process to take place. Once Parliament resumes, though, likely in late March, the opposition parties will likely bring down the government at their first opportunity and trigger an election. And all signs at this point are that the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, would win that election. And that would usher in, a much more right-wing focus on the economy, on business investment, and on likely expanding the oil and gas sector, something that Trudeau was reluctant to do because of his climate concern.
So what I find interesting is that if we take a look at the different issues that incumbents have had, whether you're looking at France or the US or Germany, even South Korea, it's sort of the other side of the ledger, right? It's like a swing from left to right. But in this case, it's his own party turned on him. That feels different.
That's right. It's been pushed by the same issues, by the concerns of voters. The Liberals have seen their fortunes falling in the polls for a year and a half now. And it's been seen that he is the person wearing that Canadians are simply tired of him. He's been in power for more than 9 years. And he has overseen this expansion of the social safety net. To his credit, child poverty has declined in Canada. But at the same time, gross domestic product per capita has declined. We have seen wages not keeping pace with inflation, at least, if you take into account the massive pandemic run-up in inflation. So people are feeling bitter about the economy and unhappy with how things have gone under his leadership. So his own party sees that and sees that the only chance they have, and really it's a very faint chance at this point to win the next election, but the only chance would be to bring in a new leader and to try and bring in some new blood at the top of the party to reinvigorate voters and bring them back. So that's kind of why you've seen his party turn against him. It's really because of the anger of Canadians.
Laura, just give us a sense of the timing. How will that work? What's the process for naming an interim prime minister?
That's right. So the person would become the prime minister after they win the Liberal leadership race. And so we're not sure yet. We are going to wait to see what he announces. But we have heard that he's asked for a suspension of Parliament, and it's been reported that that will be until March 24th. So I expect that the Liberal leadership race will take about that amount of time. So just about 3 months there. And then that person will come in and become the prime minister. And then at that point, they'll have to oversee a parliament that has turned against the sitting Liberals and oversee a confidence vote that they will likely lose, and then lead the party into an election. It may take some time for that confidence vote to happen. I don't think we can assume that, March 24th, Parliament resumes, boom, there's a confidence vote the next day. Because of the parliamentary calendar, it could be a month or two after that. But certainly, I think you can expect a spring election led by a new leader of the Liberal Party.
Is the sense now that it would go to the right, that the Liberal Party would have a hard chance of winning back?
Certainly. If the polls hold the way that they are, the Liberals could be beaten down to, they wouldn't maybe even be the official opposition party. They wouldn't be the second place party anymore. They could be the third place or even fourth place party. The polls are very, very dire. And the Conservatives would win a massive majority if the polls hold. You are really seeing a repudiation of the incumbent government in the polls at the moment. So the Liberals' hope is that bringing in a new leader would help to revive their fate, certainly. But that person is going to have a tough time persuading Canadians that just because the party has a new face means that they are offering something new. That person may find that regardless of them being a different person than Trudeau, they may still have to wear Trudeau's legacy. And while I noted some positive elements of that legacy, at the moment, Canadians are feeling angry and frustrated about the state of the economy, of their finances, of the cost of housing, and they look to the incumbent government as responsible for that.
Immigration is a big political issue here in the United States. Is it one in Canada as well?
Absolutely. Immigration is a huge part of Trudeau's legacy, and specifically eroding the Canadian consensus around immigration. For many, many years, Canadians saw immigration as a positive to the economy. We had a much more orderly system. We were sort of protected by our geography from irregular migrants because, we just share a land border with the U.S. and we have an agreement with them. So really the irregular crossings were fairly minor, except for in one province of Quebec. So for a long time, we were a very pro-immigration country. But after the COVID-19 pandemic, when businesses faced labor shortages, Trudeau's government really turned up the tap. They relaxed the rules for temporary foreign workers. Provincial governments, with the approval of the federal government, brought in huge numbers of international students. And Canada's population growth rate surged to one of the fastest in the world, really on par with sub-Saharan African countries with very high fertility rates. So, it was an extraordinarily huge ramp up in immigration, and Canadians turned against it very massively, seeing it as contributing to rising housing prices. And so Trudeau's government embarked on a huge immigration U-turn just this past fall. But, given that they were the government that ramped it up in the first place, it's unclear whether Canadians will give them that much credit for turning it around. And really, we have seen polls now showing that support for immigration has sunk to the lowest since 1998. Just a drastic turnaround for a country that was so pro-immigration, so friendly to newcomers, that when Justin Trudeau came in 2015, he came in as the prime minister hugging Syrian refugees at the airport. Yeah. He promised a really open immigration policy that Canadians supported. And now we are in a different spot. The country feels differently about immigration, and his policy certainly contributed to that.
Yes, your sister down under here to the south feels the same way on this. All right, Laura, thank you very much. We appreciate that. Laura Kane, Ottawa Bureau Chief. And a reminder, we are waiting for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada to speak in Ottawa. He's running a little bit late, but we will bring you those comments as they cross. All right, let's get a reset here. We're looking at equities still pretty much doing well on this Monday. S&P up over 1%. Let's get a business flash with John Tucker.
All right, Alex and Paul, we have 8 of the 11 major industry groups in the S&P 500. They are pushing higher right now, and it is the individual technology shares. They are in the lead. The S&P 500 right now, 70 points higher. That's up 1.2%. We're at 6,012 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, 240, let's call it 250, just round it off, up about 0.6% right now. The NASDAQ 100 is up 1.7%. That is a rise of 363 points. Chip stocks gaining today, in particular, Taiwan's Foxconn delivering the latest indication that demand for AI infrastructure is set to boom this year. And in the rate space, let's go to the long bond, 30-year right now, the yield up close to 4 basis points. That is at 4.84. We check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your abbreviated Bloomberg Business Flash.
We'll take it. We'll take it.
Okay. Yeah, not bad. Thanks for pushing higher. That's all you need to know.
That's all you need to know. All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio in New York City, streaming live. It is starting to snow here in New York, so how about that? It seems like the velocity of news coming out of the Trump camp is really starting to pick up, and it's moving markets. And this is just prepping us for a couple of weeks' time when he is sworn in again as president. Let's check in with Nathan Dean, policy analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence down in Washington, D.C. Nathan, again, the velocity of news coming out of the Trump camp seems to be picking up speed here. Tariffs, no tariffs, how aggressive are they going to be on tariffs? What's the thinking down in D.C. because we're getting some conflicting statements and reporting?
Yeah, so President Trump has always been very much pro-tariff, and, he's called for tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and other, members of the international community. But then there was this article by the Washington Post this morning that came out and said that there were advisors looking at potentially scaling some of that back, leading to President-elect Trump to put out on Truth Social that that's certainly not the case. But we take this to be the opening salvo of the soap opera portion of the Trump administration, because remember, there is a pro-tariff wing to the administration. There's also going to be an anti-tariff, pro-Wall Street wing to the tariff argument. And I think this is just the conflicting nature of those tariff argument, of this idea that, pro-tariff popular with the American people, but also the American people don't want high prices for certain goods. So I think the way it's going to work out is you're going to see an executive order, or maybe a couple executive orders on Inauguration Day or the day after, saying that he's going to institute these tariffs, but then you're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the process of it. And I think that it's going to take some time, maybe a month or 2, 3 months, for those tariffs to actually come out. Because at the end of the day, just remember, it is President Trump's decision on what these tariffs can do, and the president has a lot of authority to do it. So I think you're just going to continue to see this debate, but President Trump will make a decision, and probably within the first or second quarter of this year.
So is this going to be, the life we lead for 4 years? Like, we get a news area kind of breaking some news, and then President-elect Trump comes out and then refutes it? Because in theory, we could argue he wants to keep optionality, right? And he wants to figure out how to do it. So it's going to be hard for us to really pin it down until he actually says the words.
Yeah, exactly. Optionality is the perfect word for this. And you can say that for pretty much all Washington, because Washington doesn't make a decision on anything unless they're backed into political back corners and they're forced to make a decision. And presidents generally don't want to have their handcuffs, their hands tied when it comes to tariffs, because they are the ones that want to negotiate. Remember, President Trump is a transactional president. He wants to negotiate on this. But what we can say is, for things like tariffs, President Trump has more power. For things like reconciliation bills or tax cuts, that's going to have to go through Congress. There's going to be a process for that. And so you're not going to get the same level of optionality. You're just going to have a very slow-moving train moving eventually to its conclusion. So I think for the next 4 years, yes, you're going to have to keep in mind that there's going to be lots of changing of minds, lots of discussions, if you will, and so forth like that. But eventually there is a process for everything in Washington, and that should give you some clues of how things are going to actually play out.
Nathan, as we get closer and closer, well, actually, the Congress has been seated this week, and we've get closer and closer to the inauguration. Is there any kind of growing consensus about how helpful this Congress will be to President-elect Trump in terms of enacting some of his policies?
Yeah, so right now we're in the optimism stage of the Congress at the moment. Yeah, certainly, if you're on the Republican side, look, they're very optimistic. There's lots of talks about getting things done, but ultimately, this is very much a challenging year for the Republicans because they only have a very slim majority in the House. And when President Trump, let's just take, for example, over the weekend, President Trump said that he wants to do one reconciliation bill, one bill that would do tax cuts, border security, defense, raise the debt ceiling, and all that. He can get every single Republican to do that, great. But if he only loses 3 or 4, that entire message, that entire effort is derailed, and they want it done by April. That's probably too quick. But if you decide that you can't get it done, nothing says that you can't just break it up into 2 bills, do one in the first half of the year, one towards the end of the half of the year. That goes back to the optionality argument that Alex was just talking about here. So what we would say is that very much the Republicans are aligned on a lot of things, but the nitty-gritty is going to be extremely difficult, especially when it comes to tax cuts, because you're going to have to figure out how to pay the $4 to $4.5 trillion worth of tax extensions, and when you can only afford to lose 3 or 4 members in the House of Representatives, that's a very tall task to do. So again, Washington is going to take lots of time. There's nothing really here saying you have to get things done until things like the debt ceiling come true, or you have a government shutdown or anything like that. Kick the can is the easiest thing for Washington to do.
And we saw all of this sort of play out with the speaker vote on Friday, and just showing that very razor-thin margin. Just to end on this, it is January 6th. This is when Congress is certifying the results of the election. Can we just look at how today is different than 4 years ago? The obvious, yes, but in terms of security in place, rules in place.
Yeah, so there was obviously a lot of changes that happened after January 6th. For example, there was a fair voting rights they made it much more difficult for people to overturn, or at least seek to overturn, to challenge the election results, especially in the Senate. Here in Washington, we have a snowstorm, so obviously that's keeping a lot of people away from the Capitol and so forth. And, Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries has already said that he is going to instruct the Democrats to certify the election. So we're not going to see any of the political issues that we saw 4 years ago. Certainly a difference in time, a difference in agendas. And, time will tell as we see maybe 4 years from now if that continues.
All right, very good. Nathan, thanks so much. We appreciate that. Nathan Dean, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Policy Analyst here. In just moments, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is expected to make comments where presumably the reporting is that he will give up the leadership of his Liberal Party, which will then trigger a contest to replace him as Prime Minister.
Well, here's a red headline for you. William Barr of the Fed will continue to serve as a Federal Reserve governor, but will be stepping down as vice chair for supervision. He's going to step down February 28th or earlier if the successor is confirmed. At the same time, we also have Justin Trudeau speaking in Ottawa, the Prime Minister of Canada. Let's listen in to what he has to say.
This morning, I've woken up as Prime Minister. I've been inspired by the resilience, the generosity, and the determination of Canadians. It is the driving force of every single day I have the privilege of serving in this office. That is why, since 2015, I've fought for this country, for you, to strengthen and grow the middle class. Why we rallied to support each other through the pandemic, to advance reconciliation, to defend free trade on this continent, to stand strong with Ukraine and our democracy, and to fight climate change and get our economy ready for the future. We are at a critical moment in the world. Mes chers Canadiens, à chaque matin, je me suis réveillé en tant que Premier ministre, inspiré par la résilience, la générosité.
We are listening to Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada in Ottawa. He is speaking right now. We are taking those comments as we are expected to see him resign as leader of his party.
Depuis 2015, je me suis battu pour ce pays, pour vous, pour renforcer la classe moyenne.
We've been listening to Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau speaking French now, so it's hard for us to take it for you, but we will bring you...
French Canada is part of his constituency.
It's true, and we appreciate that. We just can't bring that to you on radio because we don't know what he's saying, but we'll keep you updated on those headlines. We're waiting for him to resign potentially as leader of his party. We will take any other headlines and Q&A that happen in English as it happens. All right, taking a look at the markets here. We are looking at an S&P up by 1.1%. Also looking at the NASDAQ up by 1.8%. It is a pretty solid rally underway as everyone kind of gets back to the office. Here we go. Justin Trudeau, back in English, Prime Minister of Canada.
Deeply about Canadians. I care deeply about this country, and I will always be motivated by what is in the best interest of Canadians. And the fact is, despite best efforts to work through it, Parliament has been paralyzed for months after what has been the longest session of a minority parliament in Canadian history. That's why this morning I advised the Governor General that we need a new session of Parliament. She has granted this request, and the House will now be prorogued until March 24th. Over the holidays, I've also had a chance to reflect and have had long talks with my family about our future. Throughout the course of my career, any success I have personally achieved has been because of their support and with their encouragement. So last night over dinner, I told my kids about the decision that I'm sharing with you today. I intend to resign as party leader, as Prime Minister, after the party selects its next leader through a robust, nationwide, competitive process. Last night, I asked the President of the Liberal Party to begin that process. This country deserves a real choice in the next election, and it has become clear to me that if I'm having to fight internal battles, I cannot be the best option in that election. Mes chers amis, comme vous savez, je suis un fighter.
You've been listening to Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, officially resigning as a party leader and prime minister. Until the party selects its next leader, he's talking about a nationwide process. He has spoken to the president of the Liberal Party and says that the president has begun that process. So again, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau resigning as prime minister and party leader. That was widely expected. All right, markets, though, still underway. A solid rally here. Let's go to Emily Grafeo of Bloomberg Markets. She's looking at all the intricacies here. So this is solid volume, solid rally. January effect, is this the deal?
Well, you know, when you look at some particular stocks, Alex, there's really quite some movement. But it does seem like there's actually fundamental news, at least Fubo TV. The stock is up 191% right now. This is the biggest jump since January 2018, when it was up 930%. I have to admit, I feel like I've kind of failed.
It's a $1 stock.
Yeah, right. It was a penny stock. So I was trying to Google, like, what actually happened on January 24th, 2018, when it was up almost 1,000%. And I couldn't find anything.
Couldn't find it. All right.
And I feel terrible about that. But the news today is that Disney and streaming provider Fubo TV are combining their online live TV businesses.
Yep.
So now you'll be able to get Hulu Plus Live TV and Fubo all in one. Fubo will remain a publicly traded company. So those shares are up massively today.
Basically,
massive
it just
spike.
ensures that it's going to be around for a while. It's getting capital from Disney, it's getting support from Disney,
Right.
and the programming from Hulu.
Disney will own 70% of the new combined company. I'm also looking at American Airlines, up about 5%, biggest jump since December 10th, 3 upgrades. I think that again speaks to maybe the optimism. People are starting the new year, maybe more optimistic on some of these stocks. So TD Cowen, Jefferies, and Melius, I think I pronounced all those names correctly.
Sure, let's go with it.
They all upgraded from hold to American Airlines. TD Cowen said that they see long-haul international flying remaining robust in 2025, which I guess you can take some macro signals from that as well. Jefferies said that forecasts for 2025 EPS for American Air are above consensus expectations. They see higher total revenue per available seat mile. I feel like as a consumer, that might mean that maybe they're going to be raising prices per seats.
I mean, they probably would like to at the end of the day.
Yeah, probably like to do that. And Melius said that concerns remain on the balance sheet, but they think that a lot of those issues are going to be more fixable in the new year. So that stock higher today. And finally, U.S. Steel up as much as 5.6%. Feels like investors are just really cheering the resiliency of these two companies, U.S. Steel, Nippon Steel, trying to merge. The government obviously trying to stop that merger for many months now. But today, the two companies jointly filed lawsuits in a last-ditch effort to preserve the planned merger of the companies. Last week, Joe Biden said that he blocked it, but now they're saying that this is a failure on the Committee of Foreign Investment in the United States panel to consider the deal on national security grounds. They're basically trying to say that this will be good for national security, so they should let the merger go through.
All right. Very good. Emily Grafeo, thank you so much. We appreciate that. So going in and out of Trudeau, is that kind of the strategy?
Yeah, so there's a couple things happening, right? You got Justin Trudeau officially resigning in Canada as Prime Minister and as head of the Liberal Party. He also prorogued Parliament, so basically discontinued a session of Parliament without dissolving it until the end of March to get all the ducks in the order in the row, talking about how he feels if he's spending so much time defending his leadership, he's not actually able to govern in the process. At the same time, Michael Barr of the Fed stepped down. I called him William Barr when I wrote the news. My bad. Michael Barr, stepping down as Fed Vice Chair for Supervision. He's going to hold on to his post in the Fed, just stepping down as Fed Vice Chair for Supervision. He's going to depart on February 28th unless a successor is confirmed earlier. So guess who's here? Michael McKee, Bloomberg International Economics Policy Correspondent,
not
joining
Michael
us
Barr,
on that.
who does the news for us.
I know, so I was like, Michael Barr. Wait, no, it's got to be William. My bad. Okay, so why is he resigning for this specific post? Sorry.
This post is relatively new. It came in after Dodd-Frank, and there have really been only, there have been two people, basically, who have had the job in the past. And the tradition sort of started in the last administration. With the vice chair resigning at the time, and now you've got Michael Barr following through, because basically you get a new administration like this with a big philosophical change, and it's going to be a big philosophical change in regulation. And so Barr, in his statement, said the risk over dispute over the position would distract the Fed from its mission. So he's decided to resign as vice chair for supervision, which has big implications for banks. Keep an eye on bank stocks, because basically what this tells you, the Fed says it won't make any new major bank regulations until a successor's in place. And with Barr leaving, that probably means that the Basel III endgame proposal is on life support at this point, if it even has a breath left. And so that's major news for financial firms, because the Trump administration would be expected to sort of junk that. But the interesting thing is he's not resigning as governor, and there are no openings on the Fed, at least not until January of 2026. And so the incoming administration cannot name a new person to the job. They could elevate one of the current governors to the job.
Interesting. So, again, I'm just looking at the banks, over the past year, they're all up kind of 30, 40%, kind of the big banks, JP Morgan, Bank of America. So it feels like, I guess since the election, people have said, banks are one of the places you have to be. And I guess this is just another example of how things are changing.
Yeah, there's been a feeling that the incoming administration would pull back on the Basel III requirements, the additional capital that the big banks would have to hold. And so this is going to be seen as good news for them. And this will just sort of confirm the idea that that's probably what's going to happen.
So endgame, Basel III endgame is the endgame.
Yeah, unless this is like the Marvel movie series where the Avengers Endgame was followed by another dozen sequels.
Okay, but to be fair, let's get into it. They wound up killing off the main characters, right? Like Captain America, Iron Man, Black Widow.
Yeah.
So it was a new generation that took on after
and
Endgame.
now Michael Barr, goes with Iron Man.
So, but to be clear, the position could still exist. He just won't do it.
The position
it's just like
exists,
a neutered
and
position.
in theory would have to be filled. The only one I can think of on the board right now who might take that job would be Mickey Bowman. She's the essentially the small bank representative on the community bank representative on the Fed Board of Governors. She's been heavily involved in the regulatory efforts of the Fed and has been a big opponent of a lot of what we've seen in the Basel proposals. And so she might be the choice. She is a Republican, and people had thought she might be a candidate for that job or one of the other bank regulation jobs. But at this point, she'd be about the only one I could think of that would take the job, because it's less of monetary policy and much more regulation.
So that's the Basel III narrative. There's also a broader narrative in the marketplace, Michael, that a Trump administration would be positive for M&A activity just in general, maybe from a regulatory perspective, if nothing else. An easier, lighter touch from the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice. What are you hearing about that type of narrative? Is that something, because I'm hearing bankers, lawyers putting that out there?
Well, it makes logical sense, put it that way. And there is some pent-up M&A demand out there. How much there is in the banking sector, I don't know. Mm-hmm. That's a question for some of the bank analysts that you have on, because we saw a lot of consolidation in the past following the financial crisis. But there are always mid-sized banks that are looking to get a little bit bigger. And so I would imagine in that space there is going to be some business for those lawyers and lenders. I'm not sure that we won't see a big impact in the mega banks, except as lenders, perhaps, because they're already at their limit for how many deposit customers they can have. But it is going to be a new era.
A new era. In terms of the Fed speak we've heard over the last, say, 3 days, have you taken anything away from it? The notes that I read tend to think like, oh, maybe we want to just roll back on these cuts. Maybe we don't want to go too aggressively. We're still really worried about inflation, et cetera. Is that your take?
Yeah, they're basically reaffirming what Jay Powell said in his news conference, that the Fed is close enough to pausing that they would consider pausing because the risks are sort of even at this point, and they want to move slowly and make sure that inflation doesn't come back while making sure that unemployment doesn't rise too much. So they're all kind of setting the stage at this point for a pause in January, and we'll see what the conditions are when we get there, because obviously if you slap tariffs on right away, there might be an immediate market reaction or something like that. But right now it looks like a pause in January, and then we'll see what happens by the time they get to March.
Pretty busy week here. With you look at the economic data calendar. What are you going to be focusing on? I guess it kind of Friday with the change in non-farm payrolls is a big one. How are you prioritizing?
That's going to be the big one. It's an interesting situation because on Thursday in Washington, you have the Jimmy Carter Memorial, and that's pushed a lot of stuff into Wednesday, like jobless claims will be out Wednesday. And also it's moved up the calendar for Treasury auctions to Tuesday and Wednesday. So at this point, it looks like by the time you get to Thursday, there will have been a sort of data and information void for the markets. So it may have a bigger impact than it usually does just because traders always have to trade on something, and this will be news in more of a vacuum.
When we take a look at the jobs number real quick, does that mean that if we get a strong jobs number, does that really wipe out the case for cuts? Like, is that really going to be the barometer here?
Well, it will have that impact immediately in the markets. Then I think people will take a look at where we are. As I say, when we get past, the next Fed meeting is January 29th. So when we get to that period, we'll have a little bit better feel for the economy than we do immediately, which is because it's December numbers. But a strong jobs report, and Bloomberg Economics thinks we're going to get 268,000 jobs.
Wow.
Consensus
160.
Wow.
So they're out on a very long limb, and we'll see how they do with that. But if we got something like that, it would certainly cement a pause for January, and then we'll see what Trump policies do to the March outlook.
Hence the 30-year yield at the highest since November 2023.
Yep.
Yeah. And you talk to some of the bond analysts, and they say we're kind of there now. With you would need something else to push us above the levels we're at for the long end, because it's steepened enough at this point. So if anybody could do that, though.
Yep. It's Donald Trump. All right, Michael McKee, thank you so much for joining us. Michael McKee covers all the economics here for us. The market's trading kind of at their intraday highs here. The S&P 500 is up 1.2%. The NASDAQ's up 1.8% here. The VIX, it's below 16. I'll call that out for Tom Keene. And again, we were just talking about the Treasury market. 10-year Treasury's up another couple basis points here, 4.61%. And why is your WTI crude oil over $74 a barrel?
I mean, maybe it's a demand thing. No, actually, a big part of it's going to be a storm if it's going to disrupt oil and gas production. So that's like a weather impact. But in actuality, many are thinking that President Trump is going to be more hawkish when it comes to Iran. And does that actually remove some barrels and tighten sanctions? Because there's been a lot of oil exported surreptitiously at the end of the day. So thank you. So if that changes, then that could actually have a material impact. But it's really hard to play the geopolitical risks in this world. All right, coming up, Brian Vendig, Chief Investment Officer at MJP Wealth Advisors, will be joining us for his outlook on the markets. It's snowing in New York. Happy Monday.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
I'm John Tucker. He in the Bloomberg Newsroom. This Bloomberg Business Flash. He had 8 of the 11 major industry groups in the S&P 500 pushing higher. Information technology and communication services leading the way. You have NVIDIA, Microsoft, Apple, and Amazon all pushing higher. The best performing individual stock in the S&P 500 right now, that belongs to Micron Technologies. That was up about 11%. Qualcomm introducing some new chips designed to power personal computers capable of running the latest artificial intelligence software. It cost as little as $600. Meantime, Kathy Bostjancic at Nationwide says, you know what, the U.S. economy remains on pretty solid footing.
You still have a lot of strong tailwinds that are helping to support activity, especially the first half of this year. We look for some moderation, but still solid growth. It's not an economy that's about to collapse.
President-elect Donald Trump denying a Washington Post report that his aides are considering narrowing his tariff plan to only apply to limited specific critical imports. Right now, the S&P 500, 73 points higher. That's up 1.25%. We're at 6,016 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 311 points, and that is a rise of 0.75%. The NASDAQ 100 up 350 points, and that is a rise of 1.6%. Long bond right now, 2 basis points higher, 483. You'd have to go back to around May to find these yields on the 10-year, the benchmark. Right now, up close to 4.61%. That's about a basis point higher. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We are streaming live on YouTube as well, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Podcast, and that's where you'll find us. All right, S&P 500 up mid-20% in 2023, up mid-20% in 2024. Can you top it in 2025? That's what the pros have to figure out here. Brian Vendig joins us here. He is a Chief Investment Officer at MJP Wealth Advisors. Brian, I'm sure you're out there with your look-ahead letter recently, telling your clients kind of what you're looking for 2025. What'd you tell them?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and great to be with you. Well, I think we're still constructive on the markets over the balance of the year, but I think it's going to be the tale of two cities, as we've seen in some other years in the past, where we have the policy uncertainties, these policy pieces, I think, that need to come together, as we've seen in recent headlines this morning with the new administration coming to town and what's going to happen with tariffs, spending, taxes, and immigration, paired with, are we still going to have earnings growth for the S&P and other parts of the cyclical parts of the economy over the balance of the year? And I think until we get through this policy uncertainty and also uncertainty that the Fed gave us back on December 18th regarding monetary policy in 2025, it's going to be choppy in the markets. I think that's easy for me to forecast, Paul and Alex, but I think if earnings is there, and we've heard from some Fed officials, from some Fed speak this morning, as you mentioned, the economy's on stable footing. Inflation probably will be sticky over the course of the year due to housing pricing. And some seasonal adjustments there. But at the end of the day, if consumers have a job, consumers will spend. We expect lower spending, but we still expect earnings to grow double digits for the S&P, and also maybe some participation coming in the markets from some areas outside of mega cap tech, even though this morning we know mega cap tech is in front of investors' optimism for a good year.
I guess the question then becomes, where do earnings actually grow? So do earnings for, say, the mega cap Mag 7 come down, and then the rest of the S&P earnings go up, and that spread narrows?
Yeah, Alex, that's a great point. I mean, that's our view. We are still expecting growth, greater than 20% year over year on the mega cap tech side. So when we think about portfolio positionings, we're definitely leaning still in that direction. Also because tech has been a great place to hide out. Obviously, when troubled waters happen in the economy, we've seen that historically, and I think that muscle memory is still going to occur for investors. But those are other areas of the market that I still say look attractive in mid and small cap, and some of those cyclical areas where the economy does slow, and we've gotten some indication that Fed cuts are still on the table. That's going to help out some of those sectors like industrials, some pocket areas in healthcare. And also, I got to give it to our friends in small cap that I know have been trailing for about 10 years. The economy's on stable footing. We're not going into a recession, and we have some domestic focus and policies. Those should help some of the smaller companies as well, assuming a good economy over the next 12 months.
How about in the fixed income space, Brian? We've got a steepening yield curve. We've now, after being inverted for several years, we've got a 10-year Treasury yield of 4.61%, 2-year 4.25%. I mean, that seems like a nice way to make a living. In the fixed income space, do you stay there, or do you maybe take some credit risk?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We actually been adding duration in our portfolios late last year into even the start of this year, and we like fixed income. I mean, we know it's been a tough investment over the last 3 years or so with anemic total returns. But again, our view as we kind of look out is that the economy will slow due to slower consumer spending. And depending on how those puzzle pieces come together from our friends in Washington, we might look at these yields right now and say, you know what, this is a great opportunity from a risk reward point of view. So we're not getting too long in duration, Paul. Going back to your question, we're not trying to be heroes here with a bond trade, but thinking about taking durations up a little bit from that 2 to 3 year to 5 to 7 year, still sticking with quality, not looking to jump in too deep on some of the high yield that's already had a good run with tight spreads. But I think fixed income is an opportunity for investors. And also, if we have troubled waters ahead with those uncertainties from policy decisions, we've seen investors come back to fixed income as a means to protect.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that we're going to see correlations kind of pick up, that the higher yields go, the more equities get hit, that inverse correlation, or do you think that both can live in harmony?
Well, I think we have seen recently, going back to the second half of December to now, we've seen that when yields have picked up, it's been tough for the equity market. Now, I'm not saying that yields at 4.6 and they come down a little bit from this morning's highs is not tolerable for the markets. But I think if you start getting above 475 on the 10-year and getting back to that 5 handle, I mean, I think the economy, based on where we are right now, can handle it. But it definitely starts to take some of the optimism out of earnings growth in some of those more cyclical areas that are dependent upon lending and the cost of debt. And then again, but this is why I say it's a first half versus second half story, not to talk and maybe too complicated here, because we know the Fed will use monetary policy to support the economy. So if we start seeing that those higher rates are being more restrictive and slowing down the economy, that's where I think the Fed has made it clear that they'll take action to kind of support the labor market and try to keep things going.
All right, Brian, really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Brian Vendig, Chief Investment Officer at MJP Wealth Advisors, joining us. So this was the headline that came out on Friday. We now have confirmation today, and obviously it's my jam, and I got excited about it. So President Joe Biden is blocking offshore oil and gas development in over 625 million acres of U.S. coastal waters, citing environmental and health risks. Clearly, you can go partisan with either of these things. You can go on the Republican side, so he's anti-oil and gas, or on the left, you can say he's not even doing enough when it comes to helping the environment. So let's get the real deal here with Simon Casey. He joins us in studio, Bloomberg Managing Editor for Energy and Commodities. I have yet to read a research note from the oil people that says this is actually materially going to hurt oil production. True, false?
Correct. I'd agree with that.
Okay.
I mean, offshore oil accounts for, I think, 14% of U.S. output, which is something, but it's not everything. And most of that U.S. oil output, I think, as we all know, comes from shale. Shell production grew substantially last year. It's probably slowing a bit, but that's where the industry has really grown enormously over the past decade and probably will continue to grow for a few years to come. It could slow this year, as I say, but there's huge amounts of resources still on land.
So is this something that President-elect Trump, when he is sworn in, he can just turn this around with another executive action?
He can try, but I think it was back in the beginning of 2017, there was a similar ban put in place, not on such a grand scale by Obama. But Trump came in, he made an order to reverse that decision, and it was stopped, I think, in the Supreme Court in Alaska, I think I'm right in saying. It didn't go beyond that. So there's no legal precedent for an incoming president to overturn an order such as this one.
And the argument that it would hurt oil and gas offshore, even though it's only 14%, a large portion that comes on the Gulf of Mexico. Is the Gulf of Mexico included in the 625 miles?
Yes, it is.
How much of it is in that versus, say, the East Coast or around Florida, for example?
I don't have the numbers right in front of me. I mean, look, the Gulf of Mexico is an important component of U.S. oil production. It's also, we should note, it's low cost, it's relatively stable. But I mean, this is a very clear move by Biden to appease the environmental lobby, the left wing of his base. If you cast your mind back to the beginning of the Biden presidency, he came in on quite a sort of a progressive energy agenda. He was trying to clamp down on oil production. He was very emphasizing a great deal his priority to tackle climate change. What's happened in the years since then? Of course, we had spikes in energy prices. We had the war in Ukraine. Energy security came to the fore. So, in a way, this is sort of his parting gift, if you like, to that part of the environmental lobby and to his supporters who wanted to see him all along try and clamp down on the oil industry to some extent.
All right, so the deep water issue that happened in the Gulf, I guess that's kind of a worst case scenario for this offshore. I guess just trying to get a sense of the risk reward here, and get away from the politics a little bit. And it seems like with fracking, maybe you don't need it as much, but at some point you might need it.
But let's have context here. So Paul's watching Landman.
Yes, I'm
So
watching
now
Landman.
he's a complete shale expert.
Okay.
But now we're talking offshore, and now it's TBD.
I don't know, yeah.
This is just the context here.
Yeah, Deepwater Horizon, worst case scenario.
Saw that movie.
But I mean, when that kind of thing happens, maybe once in a decade, once every 3 decades, it's a catastrophe, as we all saw, we all remember. There are risks anywhere you drill, to be sure. There are huge environmental issues onshore, and we shouldn't sort of downplay those either. Biden, in his announcement this morning, made clear this is, it's in relation to environmental risks. He also cited climate. He also cited the risks to communities onshore. Let's not forget the infrastructure, the industries. While they do provide a huge economic stimulus somewhere like on the Gulf Coast, they're also daily sort of environmental reminders, small oil leaks, the kind of things we don't always report on, frankly, but they do have a cumulative impact. The impact on wildlife, on bird life. Let's not forget as well that President Trump, when in his first term, he tried to clamp down on drilling offshore off the coast of Florida.
All right, Simon, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Simon Casey, Bloomberg Managing Editor for Energy and Commodities. Very much appreciate that. All right, coming up, we're going to take you back to Ottawa. Laura Kane, Ottawa Bureau Chief, on the recent resignation of Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister and head of the Liberal Party. This is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash brought to you by Oracle. Attention, growing businesses. Oracle offering to cut your current cloud bill in half if you move to Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. For new U.S. customers with minimum financial commitment, offer ends March 31st. See if your company qualifies at oracle.com/Bloomberg. It's mega cap tech stocks pushing the markets higher. AI darling NVIDIA leading the gains. The CEO there set to deliver the speech today at CES. On High Precision Industry, Foxconn reporting faster than expected 15% revenue growth after the server assembly partner to NVIDIA rode sustained demand for AI infrastructure. Then you have yields pushing higher, 10-year close to levels last seen in May. More analysts are saying the correlation between the S&P 500 and bond yields has turned decisively negative. And Disney and streaming provider Fubo TV nearing a deal to combine their online TV businesses. That's according to our sources. Fubo shares up 181%. Overall, the S&P 500 up 77 points. The Dow up 368. The NASDAQ 100 right now up 347. We check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Alex.
All right, thanks so much, JT. Alex Steele here alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news in business, economics, and finance through our lens, our Bloomberg Intelligence folks. We also tap our vast resources throughout Bloomberg News as well. So let's get to the news out of Canada. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau resigning as Liberal Party leader and Prime Minister, suspending the Canadian Parliament until March 24th. Trudeau said in a press conference and speech in Ottawa that Parliament needs a reset and needs to calm down. Want to just get the latest with Laura Kane, Ottawa Bureau Chief, joining us. Hey, Laura, what was unexpected? What did you learn from this?
Well, one thing that was unexpected was his reflection on Chrystia Freeland, his finance minister, who resigned in mid-December and really kicked off this crisis for his leadership. You know, calls had been growing for him to resign leading up to that point, but it was really her issuing that scathing resignation letter that accused him of costly political gimmicks and failing to keep the fiscal powder dry in advance of Trump's presidency that really, you know, led to his demise as Liberal leader. And so when he was asked to reflect on his side of that story, he said that when he called her in to offer her a different job than finance minister, he hoped that she would take it and believed that she would. He expected that she would stay on in cabinet in that position that he offered her of managing U.S. relations. And he did not anticipate that she would, you know, resign as finance minister very publicly and trigger this crisis. And so it was interesting to hear that. And he also said that he had hoped she'd stay on as his deputy prime minister as well, which was something we didn't necessarily know before. So I did find that surprising. But apart from that, it did sort of unfold as we expected. And I'll just add that he did confirm that a confidence vote on his government would be held in March when the Parliament resumes March 24th. And so that would mean Canada goes to an election pretty soon after that, potentially with an election day in late April or early May. That is, assuming that the opposition parties keep their word and do as they've told Canadians they would and bring down this government.
All right, Laura, thank you so much for your reporting. Really appreciate that. Laura Kane, she is Ottawa Bureau Chief. Justin Trudeau news today that he'll be stepping down as leader of the Liberal Party in Canada. Let's get back to these markets again. Another good day for the markets. S&P up 1.3%, the NASDAQ up 1.8%. It's 2025. We're turning the page. We're thinking about some new ideas, some new opportunities. One of those might be Europe, the UK, some places outside of the U.S. where certainly valuation looks more attractive. The question is there opportunity there? Tim Craighead joins us, Global Chief Content Officer. He also covers the European markets closely for Bloomberg Intelligence. He's based in London, but we got him in New York City here today in our studio. So, Tim, I know you guys came out with a big report here talking about some big themes that might be interesting for investors in 2025. Why don't you give us some of the highlights there?
Yeah, sure thing. Well, you rightfully say that valuation is intriguing from the standpoint of it is exceptionally low, and that begs the question: is there an earnings catalyst that actually brings that to fruition? And, the note today, and, I'll give kudos to Laurent Dulay and Katie Ming, who did the analysis on this, I think highlights a couple of interesting tensions that are developing. One is, just broadly speaking, we're actually seeing some positive revisions to earnings in Europe and in particular in the UK, which actually flies in the face of an awful lot of other markets, including elements of the US market, heading into year-end earnings where we're starting to see some negative revisions. Actually, it started back, a few months ago. So that element of it's cheap, do you jump in because that's an old argument. But if there's an earnings catalyst behind it, it gets interesting.
What about tariffs? How are we thinking about tariffs from the U.S. on all the things?
Yeah, well, today, the news out that maybe it's not so far-reaching, I think harkens back to number one. I think our economists are pretty smart arguing that tariffs are more of a 2026 thing than 25. It's more of a posturing element for this year in front of working out negotiations. He's, the art of the deal. He loves negotiating, and so, that's how tariffs will be used specifically from a European perspective. Frankly, it's a lot less of an issue than you might guess. An awful lot of what Europe sells to the U.S. is either services or it's stuff that's already manufactured over here. It was an interesting interview last week, maybe a week before, with Unilever, and one of the queries that Francine Lacroix had asked him is, isn't this really bad for you, because you're a European consumer product company? It's like, no, we're a U.S. consumer product company. We manufacture in the U.S. with U.S. brands. We happen to be headquartered in London, but I don't think it's that big of a deal, frankly, except in targeted specific areas that you have to watch out for. Maybe that's autos.
It's interesting here in the U.S. since the election, there's been a palpable sense of optimism from the business community, thinking that this administration would be pro-business, pro-growth, and that is argued as one of the drivers of the stock market performance we've seen since August, September, when it became clear that former President Trump might in fact win this thing. Yep. And is that what you're hearing from your European clients? How are your European clients thinking about the change we're going to have here? I actually heard some Europeans were putting more and more money into the U.S. markets over the last few months.
Yeah, I would totally agree with your conclusion. There's obviously lots of room to discuss and debate on the political side of things, whether you like it or you don't like it. Set all that aside, the idea that you're going to cut regulation and you're going to cut taxes, and maybe you're going to do things on immigration and tariffs, but that's to come. That's not going to impact this year's earnings trends. And so, yeah, I think it's a positive when you think about it from a business and economic perspective. For the moment, it's more of the earnings impetus that's good, and the inflation worry gets sort of pushed out a little bit. And European companies they do so much business back and forth with, again, a lot of it being domesticated. That's a good thing.
We have about a minute left, but what about the tariff risks when it comes to China? Because if China gets hit hard, doesn't that wind up feeding into Europe, particularly when it comes to, say, luxury goods and cars?
Well, I would agree with you to a degree. Frankly, if the whole tariff thing really goes heavy and there's lots of retaliation, the Bloomberg Economist had done a really interesting piece, you guys will recall, that basically shows the biggest hit is Mexico. The second biggest hit is the U.S. China has already curtailed so much of what they sell here, other than certain products. It's less of an issue for the Chinese economy, and it'll end up, importantly, re-globalizing connections and supply chains. It could end up being good for Europe in a weird way, because they're now a big developed market participant, with the U.S. going more insular. And last but not least, look at the luxury goods stocks and the auto stocks, they've already been totally just annihilated. So that's already priced in.
Tim, thanks so much for joining us. Tim Craighead, he's Global Chief Content Officer for Bloomberg Intelligence. He's based in our London studios. We got him here in New York. Coming up, we're checking out Geetha Ranganathan, Bloomberg Intelligence media analyst, talking about box office, maybe the Golden Globes. What's his Fubo deal? That's coming up.
Listening to Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, streaming live on YouTube as well. And we are here in New York City. Big issue. We had the Golden Globes last night. I just didn't know a whole lot of the stuff that was on there, so I'm sorry about that. So,
I knew nothing. I knew none of the movies, none of the actors.
I mean, box office has been surprisingly good, I think, this year. But and we'll get to all this with Geetha Ranganathan. She's the senior media analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. Geetha, can you talk to us about the news today that we've been mentioning? Fubo TV and Disney. A, what is Fubo TV for the people that don't know? And B, what's this deal today?
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. Thanks so much for having me. So Fubo TV is really what we call a virtual pay TV platform. So it's very much like, a pay TV package that you would get through a Comcast or a Verizon Fios. The only thing is the mode of delivery. So here, the way that you're getting all of your TV channels is through the internet. So it's a streaming TV service. And one of the things that Fubo has kind of always prided itself on is that they have a great user interface, and they're also more sports focused. So they've really kind of tried to service the sports fan, again, with what is known as this virtual pay TV platform. And, you know, kind of looking at today's deal, I think it is really a great deal for both companies, both for Disney and Fubo. For Fubo, because really there was just no way, like, yes, they did have close to about 2 million subscribers, but there was no way they were going to get to much more than that. And as you well know, Paul and Alex, you know, this whole game is about scale. And so because they really did not have scale, they've had a tough time kind of getting any profits. They've been burning through cash. They really have no leverage at all. And so this deal, which, you know, now really allows Disney effectively to control Fubo, is a great exit strategy for them in a way. For Disney, I think this was really a master stroke. So remember, Fubo has been in the news a lot last year because they basically got a lawsuit which blocked the launch of Venue Sports, which is a skinny sports bundle from Disney, Fox, and Warner Brothers Discovery. And basically with this deal, Disney got Fubo to drop that lawsuit. So I think a real master stroke here by Disney, which now paves the way for, you know, that service to kind of go live sometime later this year.
Any regulatory problems with that?
I don't think so. So Fubo was really the only one that was kind of blocking that because they said that it you know, put them kind of out of business. I don't really suspect any regulatory problems now that, you know, Fubo has basically withdrawn its lawsuit, so there's no more antitrust concerns. They were the only ones that were effectively blocking that. And Alex, this really has huge implications. Remember, apart from Venue, the other big thing that Disney is doing this year is they're actually launching their own ESPN channel. They're taking it over the top. They're calling that flagship ESPN. That's happening sometime in August. So basically you have now this double whammy, right? This double blow. You have Venue, you have the ESPN flagship launch. I think that's pretty much the death knell for pay TV as we know it. So we're going to see elevated levels of cord cutting starting in 2026.
Oh boy. Talk to us about just the box office year. We're here in January. How did the year turn out for box office? And then talk to us about the expectations for 2025 for Hollywood.
Yeah, absolutely. So 2024 box office was definitely not great, but it was much better than expected, Paul. So if you kind of look at where the year ended, we had a really strong holiday season, thanks to Moana, thanks to Wicked, thanks to Mufasa. All those movies did really well. And remember, you had a really, really strong summer season. I know you had Inside Out 2, which was the biggest movie in 2024, and then Alex's favorite, which was Deadpool and Wolverine. So, you know, you had, so you really had kind of Disney reclaim its top spot. And a lot of the movies kind of did much better than expected. So going into 2024, remember, because of all of those Hollywood strikes, we were really expecting a pretty damp year, but it turned out to be much better than expected, but still lower than 2023. And of course, much, much lower than 2019, which is really our high water mark. But going into 2025, we think a lot of those problems get solved because the biggest problem in 2024 was really the volume of movies. We just didn't have enough movies because of those twin Hollywood strikes. 2025 is going to be very different. We do have that volume kind of coming back in a big way. We know that audiences are interested. And if you just look across the board from, you know, the output from all of the different studios, they all have big banner titles. I mean, there's another part of Wicked coming out. There's the Mission Impossible movie coming out. From Disney, you have a whole bunch of, you know, movies, including Zootopia. You have Avatar. You know, you have Superman from the DC franchise. So just kind of looking across the board, the breadth, the depth, everything looks really good. So we are really expecting a huge year in terms of box office. And most people expect that this year we're actually going to reach the double-digit number, which is going to be $10 billion in box office.
Yeah, my husband had to say, Alex, you can no longer watch Deadpool movies. You're cut off for a little bit.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
I know. It's a sickness. All right, Geetha, thanks a lot. We really appreciate it. Geetha Ranganathan, Bloomberg Intelligence Analyst on U.S. media, the Golden Globes, and what was happening with Fubo and Disney as well. For our listeners, everyone in the U.S., a reminder, you can listen to us via satellite radio on SiriusXM Channel 121, access the world's only global audio business network, coast to coast, 24 hours a day, Bloomberg Radio on SiriusXM Channel 121.
Here we go. Boom.
There we
All
go.
over.
A positive day here in the
Yeah.
equity market. I mean, you call it the January effect, right? Everyone's back at work. It's going to be FOMO, as Scott Rebner of Goldman Sachs put it, fear of materially underperforming the
that, yep.
benchmark happening here. But does it last is the question.
Yeah, and you were calling it out earlier. I'll just give the latest data, just the volumes there. S&P 500 volume up about 20% above the 30-day average, so that's a good thing, too, when you see green and supported by volume.
And taking a look at the bond market, also you're seeing those back-end yields move higher. 3-year auction later today. That wraps it up for me and Paul. Coming up, Balance of Power with Joe Matthew.
This is CBS News on the Hour, sponsored by Progressive Insurance.
I'm Steve Kathan. It's a rough go from the nation's midsection into the mid-Atlantic states because of heavy snow and ice.
I had to move a little bit. I just moved just too much over and it went right off the road.
That man's car ending up in an embankment in western Kentucky. At least 3 deaths are blamed on the storm system. CBS's Chris Van Cleve.
Snow, ice, frigid temperatures, and blizzard conditions wreaked havoc on the roads across the Midwest, just as millions were trying to make their way home at the end of the long New Year's Day holiday weekend.
Man, it's ugly out here. Real ugly.
In Kansas City, Missouri, icy roads forced stranded drivers to abandon their cars and trucks.
Power is out to tens of thousands in several states. The Washington, D.C. area could get a foot of snow. CBS's Jim Krasula on storms in the south.
Confirmed tornadoes have caused widespread damage across parts of Louisiana and Mississippi. This woman's mobile home park outside historic Vicksburg, Mississippi, was heavily damaged.
It was incredible. The ground was shaking. The wind was so strong. I can feel it, and it only happened a matter of seconds.
The mid and deep south are in for record cold temperatures and biting winds.
Now to Canada, where Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he's moving to step down as his political support erodes after 9 years on the job. CBS's Chris Mavridis is in Toronto.
Once Justin Trudeau's leadership resignation becomes official, the next step will be for the Canadian Liberal Party to find a new one, and that could take a while, typically about 6 months. Not unlike the U.S. primaries, the Canadian leadership process is also long and can get really ugly. Right now, the heir apparent is the recently resigned finance minister, Chrystia Freeland. It's no secret she got under the skin of incoming President Trump when the two renegotiated the North American Free Trade Pact.
Well, here at home, Congress will act today to certify the results of the November election 4 years after the Capitol attack. Security is tight. President-elect Trump's lawyers today asked a judge to pause Friday's scheduled sentencing in the New York hush money case. Correspondent Christian Benavides is in Atlanta, where people are paying tribute to the nation's 39th president, Jimmy Carter, who died last week at 100.
You had a steady stream of people who were coming here to honor former President Jimmy Carter. I spoke to one woman who said she once came to the Carter Center for a tour of the center, and the tour guide was none other than former President Jimmy Carter.
Later this week, a funeral at the National Cathedral in Washington. Checking Wall Street, right now the Dow is up 367 points. NASDAQ is up 339. This is CBS News.
TradeMasters.com/free.
This morning, President Biden moved to ban new offshore oil and gas drilling in most U.S. coastal waters. It's a last-minute effort to block any possible action by the incoming Trump administration to expand offshore drilling. Now, a story about a monkey in a tutu along the side of a road in Missouri.
Sheriff's officers in Jefferson County, Missouri knew someone needed help when they spotted an 8-pound spider monkey wandering near Highway 21 and Route M in a hot pink and white number. It walked up to an officer and tugged on his pant leg, then held his hand as they walked to the squad car together. Police say the animal had opened the door and walked out of its caretaker's home. Monkey and human have been reunited. Deborah Rodriguez, CBS News.
Mufasa was the top film at the weekend box office, earning nearly $24 million in its third weekend. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 came in second. I'm Steve Kathan, CBS News.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
It's January 6th, 4 years later. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as lawmakers gather in a joint session of Congress today to certify the presidential election vote 4 years. Of course, after the process was interrupted by a mob of rioters on Capitol Hill. Today, we'll walk through the process together. It's just beginning. As Vice President Kamala Harris presides over the count, we'll be joined this hour by Republican strategist Maura Gillespie at Blue Stack Strategies. And as Donald Trump calls for one big, powerful bill, we will talk with our signature panel about the way forward on the border and taxes. Once we get into this Congress, we'll have our signature panel with us, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. It's all after a look at Wall Street. We start right there, right now, with Charlie Pellet in New York. Charlie, how's it look?
Right now, we are higher across the board, holding close to session highs on the S&P 500 index. Back to work Monday, and this is the first full trading week of the brand new year. So here's where we stand. We got the S&P right now up 72 at 6,014. Record, by the way, December 6, 6,090. The S&P right now up 1.2%. The Dow up 329, up 0.8%. NASDAQ up 345, up by 1.8%. Big tech powering higher. NASDAQ up NASDAQ 100 index up 332, up 1.6%. 10-year at 4.60%, with a 2-year right now at 4.25%. Gold flat on the day, $26.39 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.2%. WTI 74.10 a barrel. Bitcoin now closing in on 102,000 at 101,915, up by 3.5%. Well, certainly lots of questions for traders and investors as people await the incoming Trump administration. Bill Dudley is a former president of the New York Fed, now a Bloomberg opinion columnist, and he was interviewed this morning on surveillance.
The big transition from Biden to Trump is, under Biden, we sort of knew exactly what the policies were. And in fact, over the last 2 years, there hasn't really been much in terms of new policy initiatives. And now we're going into the Trump era, where we know there's going to be a lot of changes in policy, and we don't know yet what they're going to be. So I think we're going from a period of low uncertainty to much higher uncertainty. And that's what's got to get priced into markets. That's one reason why I think the bond market has done poorly over the last few months.
And again, 10-year 4.60%. Former New York Fed President Bill Dudley interviewed on surveillance. Briefly, Michael Barr, the Fed's vice chair for supervision, plans to step down from that role. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day. Subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. Balance of Power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. Lots going on. Once again, here he is, your host, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet. Great to see you, Charlie. Happy Monday. Welcome to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, where you can find us right now, as always. When we're live, search Bloomberg Business News Live. You'll find our stream there from our studios here in Washington every day at high noon. And of course, high noon means something today. It is the 6th of January, 2025. It snowed all night in Washington. Not a fit night out for man nor beast, to quote the great W.C. Fields. They even put the Capitol Police in hotels because what is about to happen today must happen by the Constitution. the certification of the presidential vote. What's happening right now, a quick meeting on the House side, same for the Senate. They get together, everybody says hello, and a little bit less than an hour from now, 1 p.m. Eastern time, they will gavel in a joint session of Congress to get this job done. Now, a lot of us learned about January 6th 4 years ago. This is something that typically wouldn't even make the news until, of course, what happened in 2020. They're going to carry those ballots. Remember that? In the wooden boxes across the rotunda. They will count, they will unseal them, count them, and then certify them, with the vice president, who just lost the election, presiding over the process. Again, 1 p.m. Eastern time. That's right. As the outgoing president of the Senate, it is Kamala Harris's job to preside over the count here. It is also apparently Kamala Harris's job, along with many other Democrats, to remind everyone today about what happened 4 years ago. Joe Biden had an op-ed this morning that you might have heard about. Kamala Harris took to a video to speak to people ahead of today's process, again, mandated by the Constitution. Here's the vice president.
Today at the United States Capitol, I will perform my constitutional duty as Vice President of the United States to certify the results of the 2024 election. This duty is a sacred obligation, one I will uphold, guided by love of country, loyalty to our Constitution, and my unwavering faith in the American people. As we have seen, our democracy can be fragile. And it is up to then each one of us to stand up for our most cherished principles.
Serious production values, multiple camera angles on the vice president. As I mentioned, Joe Biden writing an op-ed this morning in which he refers to what took place 4 years ago. Quote, "For much of our history, this proceeding was treated as pro forma, a routine act," he writes. "But after what we all witnessed on January 6, 2021, we know we can never again take it for granted," unquote. Glad to say that we have Maura Gillespie with us. Of course, spent a good chunk of her career in the House of Representatives, a veteran of John Boehner's Speaker's office, founder principal BlueStack Strategies. Now she is a Republican strategist as the way forward. Maura, it's great to see you. January 6th is here, and I just wonder, before we get into the details, what's going through your mind today?
It's really an important reminder, I think, just for everyone, whether you're Republican, Independent, Democrat. The peaceful transfer of power is a cornerstone of our democracy, and the very fact that it was, obstructed in ways last time in 2021 should be jarring, no matter which side of the aisle you sit on, because when that happened and what the insurrection did, it is hard for me to put into words the feeling that I had watching this play out, knowing what was coming and then watching it play out the way that it did. It's hard to really impress upon people how important it is to be objective, because I think that if it wasn't Trump supporters who were doing this, and if it was, let's say it was, Harris, Biden people are out there today and we're storming the Capitol, those same Trump supporters would be furious and would be screaming from the rooftops that they should be all held accountable. And I think that then, again, having your objective hats on as opposed to your partisan hats on is going to be really important as we move forward. But marking this day and not forgetting what happened 4 years ago is incredibly important. And I hope people will take time to remember that.
Well, there's a lot of talk about whitewashing, right? What happened on January 6th. There has been a bit of revisionist history. Donald Trump calls it a day of love when he talks about this. We also know that he's promised to pardon the January 6 rioters, and there are a lot of them. I don't know if this is going to be an across the board. There have been questions about how Donald Trump would handle that, but more than 1,500 people were charged with crimes tied to January 6th. Nearly 1,000 have pleaded guilty. I'm guessing you don't think they should be pardoned. Maura, you can speak to that, but we heard as well today from the captain of the Capitol Police, who is not in favor, obviously, of seeing them pardoned. What message would that send if Donald Trump makes good on that promise?
It sets us up as a country for mayhem, because if you can't hold the people who, again, if you were one of those people over the summer who were furious at these college students who are breaking into buildings, bashing windows, and trying to take over their campus buildings, and you said they need to be held accountable, they should all be arrested, then you should have the same exact feelings about those who broke into the Capitol, beat down our officers, both Metropolitan Police in the D.C. area, as well as Capitol Police officers, to stop a proceeding that is, again, the cornerstone of our democracy. So you can't cry wolf at one thing and then turn a blind eye to the other. They're not on the same level, but if you're opposed to people breaking into buildings and smashing in windows, then you should think that they should be held accountable in the same ways. And so for President Trump to go ahead and issue a blanket pardons is just a terrible look for our justice system. But two, I do think that there are certain cases that can be looked into. I'm not saying, I'm not opposed to that. I think our criminal justice system needs to be looked into. I think there are certain cases that can be looked into as far as how far their sentences go. But to issue a blanket pardon is so dangerous and sets a terrible precedent for our country moving forward.
Well, I'm guessing that Adam Kinzinger doesn't like the idea. You worked for the former Congressman Mora. Of course, he was on the January 6th committee. We don't know. Donald Trump has threatened to prosecute some of the folks, or all of them, who were involved in that investigation. Is there a place in the Republican Party for the Adam Kinzingers of the world, John Katko's, the Mitt Romneys of the world?
There is, if they want to be. My thing has always been, one, the idea about, not the idea, but what happened on January 6th, you can take a strong stance against that and say and call it out and say that it was wrong and say that it was a violation of what we stand for as a nation and for a democracy, and still believe in Republican policies and put forward ideas, conservative values, and still identify as a Republican. Again, I want to reiterate that what happened on January 6th, whether Republican or Democrat, should appall you, should truly be something that can never happen again. And that doesn't make you any less Republican by saying that, because, again, roles reversed. If a Democrat mob was coming to storm the Capitol to overturn the 2024 election, Republicans would be outraged. But again, on that day in 2021, it wasn't just Democrats being targeted. It was Mike Pence being targeted for the job that Kamala Harris is about to do today in certifying the election. It was all members were scared. Republican members were scared. The most MAGA Republicans were scared and hiding from the mob that day. So let's just remember that, that yes, there is a role for Republicans, like those who believe that January 6th was wrong, but also who believe in a smaller, more accountable government, who want to see our energy sector thrive, who want to see our grocery bills come down. We can do both. You don't need to take away your own values and what you stand for to appease the Trump MAGA people. I just don't think that that's the way forward for us.
I only have a minute left, Maura. If people should be appalled by what happened 4 years ago, should they not be inspired by what's about to happen today?
They should be very proud that our system stood that day in January 2021 and that it continues to thrive today because of adults in the room who are willing to do the job that they were tasked with, that they gave an oath to do. That is what we call leadership. And it's important that this continues on past this moment, past the Trump MAGA world moment, because our democracy has stood for almost 250 years, and I intend for it to continue on much longer past my lifetime.
Maura, it's great to see you. I really appreciate the fact that you could join us on this day. Good luck digging out of our snowstorm here in the nation's capital. Maura Gillespie, Blue Stack Strategies. I will remind everybody that in the throes of the last couple of years here, we also covered the passage of the Presidential Transition Improvement Act. We'll talk about that a bit more. The idea was to prevent any possibility of what happened 4 years ago, watering down the role of the vice president and making it more difficult to object to what's going to happen. It is unlikely that either will matter, though. This is expected to go off without a hitch today, and we'll walk through it together, starting, as I mentioned, at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. About 45 minutes from now, we'll begin the joint session of Congress. We've got a lot more ahead, only on Bloomberg.
on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks higher across the board. We are off session highs on the S&P, but still looking at a gain of 68 points at 6,011. That is an advance of 1.2%. Dow Industrials up 307, a gain now of 0.7%, while the Nasdaq Composite Index is up 329 points for Nasdaq, a gain right now of just about 1.7%. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.60% with a 2-year at 4.25%. Gold, little change, down less than 0.1%, 26.38 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude flat on the day, 73.98 a barrel. Big move, though, in Bitcoin, now at 102,000 for Bitcoin, an advance today of 3.6%. Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel have jointly filed lawsuits in a last-ditch effort to preserve the planned merger of the companies, which was blocked last week by President Biden. Nippon Steel, the ADR, is down 1.7%. U.S. Steel up now by 4.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here is Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much, and welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power. It's still snowing in Washington. It's been snowing since about midnight, and we're still apparently going to get this certification done. The Capitol Police in hotels last night, a lot of lawmakers were too, so they could be there today, about a half an hour from now, for the joint session in which Donald Trump's electoral victory will be certified. We'll have live coverage of this, remembering, of course, what happened 4 years ago. A lot of us are paying attention in a way that we would not have otherwise. This pro forma session became a massive news event and a tragedy. And this time, it looks like things are going to go off without a hitch. Kamala Harris will preside over the process as they unseal, count, and certify the votes. Then it's on to governing in the next couple of weeks, at least. Lawmakers don't have to wait for Donald Trump to be inaugurated on the 20th, and they've got a lot of work to do. Imagine how Mike Johnson felt last night, waiting for the snowstorm. It was a little bit after 9 o'clock when the Truth Social went out. 3 words, one powerful bill. If you listen to this program or watch us on YouTube or Bloomberg TV, you know that's been the big question around here. Sequencing, what do we do first? You want to hit the border, Mr. President? We're going to do the Trump tax cuts. It would take longer, of course, to write that tax code legislation, so maybe we just deal with the border. The answer is no. Donald Trump wants it all done at once, and there's probably some logic here after what we saw Friday with the election of a speaker. Almost wasn't. There may be really only one shot at getting all of this done, and the idea of coming back around with a second reconciliation bill has people wondering if that, in fact, is the way to go. Now, we heard it from the speaker on this. He knew it was coming. He talked about it on Fox Business. Here's Mike Johnson on one powerful bill.
We're 15 days out from the inauguration of President Donald J. Trump for his second term, and we want to make sure that we're jump-starting the agenda now over the next 2 weeks so that he's prepared and ready on day one. President Trump is going to prefer, as he likes to say, one big, beautiful bill. And there's a lot of merit to that because we can put it all together, one big up or down vote, which can save the country, quite literally. Reconciliation is the way to get it done. Why? Because you avoid a 60-vote threshold in the Senate. We're targeting a vote in the House, it may be in the first week of April.
You know, he didn't use the word beautiful in the Truth post, just one powerful bill. We'll see what they end up calling it here. He actually wrote a lot more. He says, we'll make it even better. No tax on tips. It will all be made up with tariffs and much more from countries that have taken advantage of the U.S. for years. Republicans must unite and quickly deliver these historic victories for the American people. So much for the first 100 days. It sounds like it's about the first day. So Nathan Dean is eating his Wheaties and his phone keeps ringing because everybody around the world with a terminal wants to know what the heck this means for their investments. It's been a minute since we've spent some time with the senior U.S. policy analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. Did you get shoveled out? Did you plow the driveway, Nathan?
We're still snowed in here in Northern Virginia, so maybe I'm hoping by Wednesday.
They got more in Virginia. There's like 8 inches down in Alexandria. It's like twice as much as the city, but you're a Chicago boy. You're fine with that, right?
I'll drive in sometime this week. So
yeah. sometime this week. So what do you think? One big bill. Maybe it's beautiful, maybe it isn't. We're going to find out a lot about what the parliamentarian thinks here at some point. Is it possible for Republicans to package the border and taxes in one swing at reconciliation?
Yeah, anything's possible at this point. I mean, this is the point of the administration where everybody's aligned and this is kumbaya. Everybody's, there's a lot of optimism going around the Republican Party, but it's easy to be optimistic when you're talking about high-level goals. You want to keep these tax extensions going. You want to do something on the defense. You want to do something on border and so forth. That's easy. What's more difficult is when you get into the nitty-gritty of how you're going to pay for $4 to $4.5 trillion worth of tax extensions. How are you going to incorporate tariffs into this as a way to pay for it? And that's where things are going to get a little bit bogged down. I mean, remember, Washington doesn't move quickly. And there is no real deadline here. When Speaker Johnson says April or May, there's really no deadline here until you talk about the debt ceiling when the X date comes, probably sometime this summer. So don't be surprised if this process comes into like 2 bills or 1 bill, but ultimately they got to figure out how to do all this stuff without losing just a handful of votes. So I'm saying they can certainly do it, but it just may not be as speedy and optimistic as what they're painting right now.
Is there logic behind doing it once as opposed to twice, knowing that it would be potentially more difficult the next time around? And will the parliamentarian knock down some of the border policy stuff here? Because, well, reconciliation is a budget mechanism, right? If you're not moving money, you're not reconciling.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so just remember, for the folks listening, reconciliation is a process where you can bypass the filibuster. Think of it as a budget resolution. You can't do things like raise the national minimum wage. It has to be things that impact the budget, and Senate parliamentarian is the one that rules on that. Now, theory goes you could get rid of the Senate parliamentarian and get a new one, but generally the Senate really respects that. So some of the border stuff, if it is funding for the border, I think the Senate parliamentarian would be able to approve that. If it's, funding for immigration policies, I think the Senate parliamentarian is there for it. But what I would say is the idea was over the holiday break that you would have 2 bills. The first one focused on border, defense, and domestic energy production. Get that out of the way early, and then you focus on tax extensions. The tax extension portion of this is going to be the more difficult one. And so there's nothing that prevents you from doing the tax extensions now or later. It just has to be done before December 31st, 2025. And Senator Thune even just said about 40 minutes ago that he's not a process person, he's a results person. So if they go through this plan of a big, powerful bill, and they begin to realize that the tax stuff takes a little bit longer, I wouldn't be surprised if you could see them change the course and say, okay, fine, we'll put out a reconciliation bill on the border and defense right now as we continue to work on tax, because nothing is preventing them. And Washington loves to kick the can on certain things and take the easy way out, and that's certainly a way for them to do that.
Well, I find it fascinating that we're looking at April 1st here, by the way. It all could come down to April Fool's Day, and that's because that's the date for the special elections in Florida. The 1st and 6th districts, right? We've got Matt Gaetz, Donald Trump raiding the House to get a couple of folks for his administration here. Johnson said he wants to pass the bill itself in the House in early April. Should we assume that that's the timeline based on the required math to get this done?
So I think that's what Speaker Johnson is presuming for. I'm telling my clients that I think the House vote will probably be before the 4th of July. I wouldn't be surprised if this goes into May or June, because just remember, I mean, you can only lose a handful of votes. And let's just pick on the SALT deduction for a moment, the state and local tax deduction. President Trump is meeting with a lot of Republicans from New York, New Jersey, and California this week to try and stave off some of those concerns. But if you have 6 or 7 members of the House stand up and say, look, I can't vote for this. I'm in a swing district. If I vote to keep the SALT deduction away, I'm going to lose my job. Then you don't have a bill. So I think Speaker Johnson is going to have to just figure out how to get all these parties to play nice. I wouldn't be surprised if they, try for April, and you'll continue to see these statements for April. But I'm thinking May, June is probably more likely time frame.
Don't you love that? You just got exactly what Nathan's clients get. That's why you listen to Balance of Power. We're all Nathan's clients here. Little lightning round, I fear, because we're a little bit short on time, Nathan, but a couple of big ones that we need to hear from you on. As clients, Michael Barr stepping down, the Fed's vice chair for supervision. Is Basel III dead?
Yeah, so I literally am just getting that question as we speak. Basel III, I don't think it's going to happen in 2025, 30% chance. maybe comes back in 2026. This is a disagreement between New York and Washington we're hearing at the moment, but it really is personnel as policy. We have to wait and see who the next vice chair of supervision is.
Fascinating. What does Donald Trump think about that, though? Who would end up in a role like that?
So, I think the first person would be Governor Michelle Bowman. She is the Fed governor who's been most outspoken in the Basel III endgame. She's a community bank activist, community bank supervisor by trade. I think if she were to come in, the question is the Basel III endgame, should you put something out that's acceptable to the banks, or should you just not put something out at all based on principle? And we're hearing that argument from folks of the Republican Party, both here in Washington and New York. I think ultimately what they'll do is 2025 will be the great pause, if you will. I don't think there's going to be much work done on it whatsoever. And then as we get towards the end of 2025, maybe in discussions with the banks, they'll figure out how to move forward and then put something in place to keep our Basel Accords in line with the international community.
Yeah, producer James, pretty glad we didn't have the Basel III T-shirts made up. I thought that was going to be the big gift this year. I guess there's still time. I saw the statement from Senator Tim Scott. Nathan, my God, from his supervisory failures during the spring of 23 bank failures to the disastrous Basel III endgame proposal, Michael Barr has failed to meet the responsibilities of his position. I stand ready to work with Donald Trump to ensure we have responsible financial regulators at the helm. How will he be remembered in this role, Nathan?
I'm not exactly sure how it will. I mean, he came in with bipartisan support just because, he was an individual that was supposed to be, bringing, I think, he's done a lot that the progressives will be thankful for. He's done somewhat that the banks aren't so happy about. So I think time will tell, but ultimately the Republicans are going to try and move forward to roll back a lot of his initiatives, and they're going to be able to do that over the next 2 to 3 to 4 years.
Donald Trump on Truth Social just now. Biden is doing everything possible to make the transition as difficult as possible, despite what we heard from his incoming chief of staff. From lawfare such as never been seen before to costly and ridiculous executive orders on the Green New scam and other money-wasting hoaxes. Fear not, he says these orders will be terminated shortly. He's talking about this drilling ban, presumably, Nathan, in our remaining moment. I'm guessing your clients are asking about this too. If you're invested in oil or natural gas, is that all going to change in a couple weeks?
Yeah, so the power of the presidency is more powerful when it comes to energy, especially domestic energy production. So out of all the sectors that we cover, President Trump does have a little bit more authority via executive order there. So I certainly would expect the president to move forward, and then you'll see the regulatory or deregulatory effort play out in 2025 as opposed to 2026 or 2027.
Joining us from his snowed-in bunker in Northern Virginia with, I will add, Stumpy at his side, the great Nathan Dean. Nathan, it's good to see you. Happy shoveling and plowing. He's the best, right? Bloomberg Intelligence senior U.S. policy analyst. We get our hooks into Nathan as often as we can so we can answer the same questions our clients are asking when it comes to investment decisions and exactly what Washington means about all of them. We'll have a lot more with our panel coming up. They're with us today, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, on this January 6th on Bloomberg.
12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We are off session highs. Still a lot of green on the screen. Back to work Monday, and this is the first full trading day of the brand new week. We have got the S&P 500 index right now pushing higher by 1.1%, up 64 points, 6,006 where we stand right now. We've got the Dow up 270, up by about 0.6%. NASDAQ up 311 now, up by 1.6%. Year 10-year 4.61%, the 2-year 4.26%, and we have got gold a little change down 0.1%, 26.36 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude now down 0.4%, 73.70 a barrel, and Bitcoin pushing higher by 3.1%. Briefly was at 102,000, right now 101,500 on Bitcoin. Major U.S. economic data on tap this week, and with a preview, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The Labor Department issues December's jobs report Friday, and most Wall Street forecasters anticipate moderation after November's hefty gain at 227,000. Bloomberg Economics is an outlier, saying it sees recent trends fueling a much larger increase, topping 250,000. Case in point, weekly jobless claims are an 8-month low. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Another Monday and another major Bitcoin purchase by MicroStrategy. MicroStrategy has bought another 101 million of Bitcoin. Right now we have got MicroStrategy shares up by 4.6%. And Disney and the streaming provider Fubo TV have agreed to combine their online live TV businesses, creating the second biggest digital pay TV provider. Disney shares up 1.1%. Fubo now surging by 235%. Again, recapping here, S&P up 60, up by 1%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, and here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet staying north of 60th Street for now. Charlie, it's good to see you, and welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power. We're live in Washington. I'm Joe Matthew. It's still snowing out, James. It's still snowing out. We've got about a half foot maybe on the ground here. Yeah, there's still a couple flakes. Then we get they dumps a lot more on us. The plows are trying to keep up with it. It's not going to interfere, we're told, in the certification of the vote. A live view of our Capitol on a snow day in Washington for those of you with us right now on YouTube, where you can always find us. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. We're about 20 minutes away from the proceedings unfolding. One of the most interesting stories producer James put in front of me this morning, coming from Politico magazine, as we find the nexus only on January 6th, of course, between Al Gore and Mike Pence. Yeah, this is a great story. It brings us to a memorial service for Joe Lieberman last summer. Al Gore was there, so was Mike Pence, and Gore thanked Mike Pence for his actions on this day 4 years ago. Mike Pence said something surprising in response. He suggested to Al Gore he had done what he did on January 6th, 2021, as the gallows were being erected on the east side of the Capitol, because of what he saw Al Gore do. Because he witnessed a vice president like him stand up to pressure from his own party. This was 2001. To defy the Constitution, even though doing so by definition meant personal defeat. I never forgot it, Pence said to Gore. Gore said, you don't know how much that means coming from you. We were all kind of blown away that that wasn't everywhere today, that story, as we wait to watch the process unfold without interruption 4 years later. Our signature panel with us here for the duration. Jeannie Shanzano, Democratic strategist, of course, senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and Rick Davis, Republican strategist, partner at Stone Court Capital. It's great to see you both here. Jeannie, I'm struck by the lengths to which the administration has gone out of its way today to remind everybody of what happened 4 years ago. Kamala Harris out with a carefully crafted video. Joe Biden wrote an op-ed. Is that Democrats' job today, to remind people of the last time we did this?
It is. I think it's all of our jobs to think back to 4 years ago and, to condemn the violence of that day and to support fully the peaceful transfer of power the way it should be. And I, too, was struck by that really fascinating op-ed that you just mentioned. It's quite a story. And I think it speaks to something that we don't spend an awful lot of time on, which is the fact that there is a long history in Congress, even before 2021, of people not willing to certify the votes of the other side when their side lost. Now, never did it rise to the level that it did in January 2021. But that is a reminder, this op-ed, that it is not just one-sided and it's not just one moment. And that's what is a little bit frustrating, that the focus all on Donald Trump and all on his supporters sort of misses the larger story as to how we ensure, beyond the Electoral Count Act, which is critically important, that this doesn't happen again, because we've been dangerously close numerous times.
You mentioned the Electoral Count Act. We talked about that as it was being debated. The Presidential Transition Improvement Act, raising the requirement in both the House and Senate to object to the results and kind of removing the vice president from the process, making it more of a ceremonial one. Rick, I don't know what's going through your mind today, but I wonder if this exercise, assuming it does go off without a hitch, as everyone expects, puts this process back in the pro forma category so it's not covered every year? Or will January 6th always have a new meaning following what happened 4 years ago?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that January 6th, certainly this year and maybe well into the future, will be remembered as a troublesome day. I wonder sometimes if it had snowed 4 years ago, would there have been a riot on Capitol Hill? Because nobody wants to go out today in this weather. And yet, seriously, Joe Biden's op-ed is worth considering. Never forget. I think that's what he's imploring the public to do here. And so if you want to think about what makes our democracy stronger, is the idea that we did get challenged 4 years ago. There was a mob that attacked the Hill to try and stop the count. And they were both repulsed. The count went on, and we expect never to have another instance like that as long as we remember what happened last January 6th. Now, there are a lot of people who would like us to forget it or think it was something other than what it was. And so it's not just in a vacuum. It is a competitive debate as to whether or not we were under attack on our democracy 4 years ago. And I don't think there's any question about that. And I'm glad that there's getting the attention today on it, and hope 4 years from now it'll get the same amount of attention.
Love to hear from both of you on words today from the chief of the U.S. Capitol Police. Speaking exclusively in an interview with the Washington Post, we've not heard him react to this idea of pardoning the January 6 rioters. He was not specific about Donald Trump's promise here, but said, quote, "What message does that send to police officers across the nation if someone doesn't think a conviction for an assault or worse against a police officer is something that should be upheld, given what we ask police officers to do every day?" Jeannie, what would that message be?
It's absolutely the wrong message. And you look at public opinion polls and the public agrees. Even in the Republican Party, this is not a wildly popular idea. So while Donald Trump's approval ratings have skyrocketed since January 2021 in comparison, the idea of pardoning those folks from January 6th has not. So that is one important thing to remember, that the public does not support that idea broadly. That said, January 6th looms very, very small in people's memories. When you look at public opinion polls, only about 5% of Americans say it's something that they remember in terms of Donald Trump's presidency. So there is a ways to go in terms of reminding people. And the whitewashing continues to this minute. We have Donald Trump over the weekend hosting a watch party for a documentary on John Eastman, of all people. We have him posting on Truth Social today about the gathering at the Ellipse where he spoke on January 6th. So he is continuing down this road of, as you call it properly, whitewashing. And that is what historians and all of us are confronting as he seeks and will, I'm certain, pursue this wide-ranging pardon, which he has every right to do, of these more than 1,000 people.
We've got a live view from the rotunda in the U.S. Capitol here as we prepare to see the mahogany boxes that will contain the ballots delivered to the House chamber. That's where this joint session, of course, will meet starting about 10 minutes from now, at least is the plan here to gavel things into session. As we wait for this to begin, Rick, this interview with the chief of the Capitol Police, do you believe Donald Trump will make good on that promise? He's indicated in some interviews that he'll go case by case. He's suggested in some rallies that everybody gets a blanket pardon. What do you see coming?
Yeah, it's hard to predict what Donald Trump will do. And I think there's a bit of a debate around him on this topic because you don't have to look very far back to last spring when students and agitators rallied around campuses in anti-Israel slogans, and attacked administration buildings. And Republicans of all scores came out and attacked those assemblies as being violent, inappropriate. And now the same people have to look into the mirror and say, well, isn't an attack on our Capitol, sort of from a moral equivalency much worse than what I decried on the college campuses across America last spring? How do you face that? How do you reconcile those two differences? They are stark in contrast. So I think that there'll be a lot of egg on people's faces in the Republican Party if Donald Trump gives a blanket pardon. If he wants to go person by person, and I'm not sure it has a significant difference, but he seems committed to do it. And, he'll pay a price with the public because I don't think there's any question that the public sees the attack on the Capitol as an insurrection, regardless of what Donald Trump's tried to convince him of over the last 4 years.
As we spend time with Rick and Jeannie in advance of the joint session that will certify the vote, we do have news as well today, courtesy Donald Trump via Truth Social. It may not be a big surprise. I think Mike Johnson saw it coming, but it answers questions about the congressional agenda once we get through this today, exactly how they're going to attack the issues, the promises that Donald Trump made. Remembering, it was a question. You go border first, you do tax cuts first. Donald Trump says you do it all at once. One big, powerful bill. Jeannie, will it work?
I think he said bigly, Joe Matthew.
I didn't see that.
Bill. No, he did not. I'm sure he's hoping it works, much to the dismay probably of John Thune at this point. But this is what we saw some Republicans in the House calling for, most notably Jason Smith and some others. And so, we'll have to see. It is really difficult for me at this point to imagine how you string this together with the very narrow margins they have. It would be one thing to talk about something that most Republicans agree on, which is the border and immigration. That would have been an uphill battle, but you can see that. It's hard for me to imagine how you do it when you're talking about spending, when you're talking about taxes. I mean, there is so much disagreement in the Republican House and even in the Senate and how you string that all together. But I think it's a recognition that Donald Trump knows he has only about 12 months maybe to get this done before it's going to be difficult as a lame duck. So he wants to go big or go home. So I think that's what he's going to try to do.
Just about a minute here, Rick. You know the rules of the Senate as well as anybody. John Thune respects the Byrd rule. He's not going to cross the parliamentarian. Can Donald Trump get all of this into a reconciliation bill?
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the reasons why Thune has been advocating two reconciliation bills. And we did hear in the same communication that Trump said, I have a lot of respect for Senator Thune, and he's got a different approach, and we're going to consider that too. So it's not a done deal in any shape or fashion, but I think we all have to understand Donald Trump's got a majority in the House and the Senate, and he's more likely to get his agenda passed than any other outcome. And he got the speaker he wanted, even though there were Republicans in the House of Representatives who opposed it. And he's likely to get the bills he wants passed the same way. He's going to have to lobby him. He's going to have to make phone calls, but he won't be the first president to have ever had to do that. And so I think we can anticipate all kinds of different components of his agenda being passed, whether it's in, perfect form. Nobody ever gets their bills passed perfectly. Ronald Reagan had an old adage, give me 80% and I'll be happy.
We're witnessing now with Rick and Jeannie the transfer of the boxes, the mahogany boxes that contain the votes to be certified. Senators are now making their way over to the House chamber. When we come back in just a moment, our second hour, we will have live coverage of the certification of Donald Trump's victory here on Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
It's time to certify the votes. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as lawmakers gather in a joint session of Congress to perform their constitutional duty 4 years after the process was interrupted by a mob of rioters. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kaylee, it is January 6th, 4 years later.
Yeah, and this proceeding stands in stark contrast to what we saw 4 years ago, as no one inside the Capitol or outside it, as far as we know, is contesting the results of this election. In fact, the woman who was defeated in November will be presiding over the proceedings today. Vice President Kamala Harris is actually already at the rostrum, standing next to the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. The gavel has come down. These proceedings will be getting underway shortly as they count these electoral votes, and Donald Trump will be officially certified as president incoming.
This is an important moment. If we could show our viewers on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube what's happening on the House floor right now, seeing these two together, knowing this morning Kamala Harris issued a video talking about what happened, reminding people to remember what happened 4 years ago on this occasion, one that was beforehand considered a pro forma thing that didn't even get covered in the news. Joe Biden writing an op-ed today for that same reason, Kaylee. Now we're watching lawmakers gather on the floor. They will go through a very deliberate process here that took many more hours to conduct 4 years ago.
Yeah, into the late hours of the night because of a disruption, of course, from the protesters. And of course, this January 6th is coming as we await 2 weeks from today, the inauguration of Donald Trump, who may very well, if his words are to be believed, pardon many of those who were convicted on crimes from this day 4 years ago. So just an incredible anniversary and an important part of the peaceful transfer of power we are marking today.
Something that idea of pardons, by the way, frowned on in an interview with the chief of the U.S. Capitol Police earlier today by the Washington Post. The sealed votes have been escorted in the big mahogany boxes toward the chamber, and Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall has more on the process that we're about to witness. Tyler?
Joe. So all eyes are going to be on Vice President Kamala Harris, who, according to the 12th Amendment, in her role as President of the Senate, needs to oversee these proceedings and, as you've been talking about, essentially certify her own election loss. But as this all gets going, this is, of course, a time-tested tradition in our country's peaceful transfer of power. And what we're going to see about to happen here is that she will open up what's known as their certificate of electoral votes. That's for each of the states, each of those electoral college votes that was allotted to them. And though she's going to go in alphabetical order, and that essentially opens up the floor for any objections if anybody does want to object. We're not expecting that to happen. Once all of those votes are in, the final tally comes in, then Kamala Harris will certify the electoral college results. Now, you mentioned that she released this video statement today talking about how important she does feel that this duty is, and I want to play both of you part of that statement and how she's framing her official role today.
Today at the United States Capitol, I will perform my constitutional duty as Vice President of the United States to certify the results of the 2024 election. This duty is a sacred obligation, one I will uphold, guided by love of country, loyalty to our Constitution, and my unwavering faith in the American people. As we have seen, our democracy can be fragile. And it is up to then each one of us to stand up for our most cherished principles.
So just a quick reminder on the vote count total, Trump won 312, Harris Walz 226. We are not expecting these results to be contested, but I can already tell you that security is incredibly high on Capitol Hill. I was there on Friday, seeing those barricades start to go up. We know the Secret Service has deemed this a special event so that they actually brought in thousands of officers from across the country to help secure the Capitol just in case.
Well, and of course, it's just in case because 4 years ago, we saw hundreds of officers being assaulted by rioters at the Capitol. And 2 weeks from today, as Donald Trump takes the oath of office at the Capitol, he has said that very day he could pardon many of those people. We have to keep that in mind today as well.
Right. He's used this word saying that he's inclined to pardon what we know 1,500 people so far having been charged in connection with the January 6th riot. Now, the Department of Justice actually just this morning released new data about this. Of course, they've been tracking this closely, and they're saying that there's potential for up to 200 more people, including 60 of those 200, to be further charged. That federal prosecutors are looking at reports from the FBI for this additional 200 people. 60 of those potentially charged in connection to how they interacted with Capitol Hill police officers today. You mentioned it, alluded to it at the top, Joe, that the Capitol Hill chief of police coming out also today saying that he thinks it would be a mistake, ultimately, if anybody who had been charged or is potentially charged in connection to a crime with a Capitol police officer, if any of those pardons were to go through.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, great reporting. Thank you
Tyler.
so much. Here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. And if you are joining us on TV or on YouTube, I think we can show you, again, live pictures of the floor of the House. A joint session of Congress, of course, about to get underway. Members are busy milling about, talking to each other before things officially get started. But of course, we have seen those that will be presiding over these proceedings, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, standing shoulder to shoulder with Vice President Kamala Harris as she gets set to certify her loss in Donald Trump's election victory.
Seeing a lot of smiles on the floor, not unlike what we saw on the opening day of the Congress on Friday, Kaylee, and a striking difference from 4 years ago. There are no masks, and a lot of people are standing close to each other, in many cases hugging and getting along. This is a different world than we were in, of course, 4 years ago. Of those rioters charged and convicted that Tyler talked about, more than 1,000, by the way, pleaded guilty to those crimes, we'll remind ourselves. It was remarkable walking around here last night. The bulk of the Capitol Police Force was encouraged to stay in town. And the D.C. Metro Police backing them up, along with uniformed Secret Service. There was a cruiser with 2 officers at every intersection across the downtown area.
Well, and there's incredible fencing all along the National Mall. And of course, the closer you get to the Capitol, the more intensified security becomes. All of it, though, precautionary, given the events of 4 years ago, but not seen as needing to be a fortification against violence as it was 4 years ago. It is expected these proceedings will go much more smoothly this time around. Again, no one is contesting the results of this election or has threatened violence in any way upon these proceedings that we know of. We're seeing now, if you're with us on YouTube and TV, the Vice President-elect, Senator J.D. Vance, in the chamber as well.
Spending some time with Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I do wonder what it is they're discussing here as Speaker Mike Johnson and Vice President Kamala Harris stand by in the Speaker's rostrum. Let's listen live for just a moment to Vice President Kamala Harris gaveling us into session.
The House come to order.
Need to get everyone in their seats first, Kaylee. That could take a minute.
Mr. Speaker and members of Congress, pursuant to the Constitution and laws of the United States, the Senate and House of Representatives are meeting in joint session to verify the certificates and count the votes of the electors of the several states for President and Vice President of the United States. After ascertainment has been had that the certificates are authentic and correct in form, the tellers will count and make a list of the votes cast by the electors of the several states. The tellers on the part of the 2 houses will take their places at the clerk's desk.
So as she noted there, Joe, this is constitutionally mandated to happen today. It was one of the many reasons why the House Speaker vote of Friday was seen as so important, as this is a proceeding that the founding document of the United States mandates does need to take place. And again, just 2 weeks before Donald Trump's inauguration.
Updated through the Electoral Count Act and the Presidential Transition Improvement Act, it reads, Congress shall be in session on the 6th day of January succeeding every meeting of the electors, set for 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We're 8 minutes into the hour right now. This is, of course, going to be a process that will carry us through a bit of the afternoon here, Kaylee.
Without objection, the tellers will dispense with reading formal portions of the certificates. After ascertaining that the certificates are regular in form and authentic, the tellers will announce the votes cast by the electors for each state, beginning with Alabama.
To think that we are covering this with such granular detail, Kaylee, is something that, frankly, has not been done in the modern era, because this was never a process that was supposed to really matter. It was a pro forma, it was a rubber stamping. Now we're listening to everywhere.
Seems to be
incredible how 4 years can make such a difference, keeping in mind here that we have not seen a vice president have to preside over their own loss in 24 years since Al Gore did this after the 2000 election. And of course, the last time we saw a vice president certifying the results was Vice President Mike Pence, who certified his ticket's own loss, and of course was facing great threat to his own life at that time, given the events of January 4th. And we want to go, or January 6th, rather. We want to go now, as these proceedings are still underway in the House chamber, to someone who was in the Capitol 4 years ago. Former Congressman Dan Kildee, who used to represent Michigan, is here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Sir, thank you very much for your time. I would love if you could share with us just your reflection on how different this is 4 years ago to the day that you and your colleagues and members of the police forces were fearful of their lives at the time these proceedings were getting underway.
Yeah, obviously it's a completely different situation. Gratefully, it's different in some ways. I mean, I obviously preferred a different outcome in this past election. But as you can see, my colleagues, Democratic colleagues, who are disappointed in the outcome, disagree with the choice, are there to certify the will of the American people. 4 years ago, not only was there a mob sent by the then president, soon to be President Donald Trump, not only was there a mob that came to attack, but there were colleagues on the floor of the House of Representatives, a majority of the Republican members, who participated in this whole attack in many ways by validating the necessary precondition to the attack, and that is this belief that somehow the election was not valid. Look at what we're seeing right now. It's what democracy is supposed to look like, even when we disagree with the outcome. Personally, it's really tough because I can't even look at some of those colleagues that I served with in the same way after they contributed to what was really the closest we've come to losing our democracy in 150 years.
Congressman, it's good to see you as always. I'll remind everybody that you were on with us on January 6th, 4 years ago, and we went back and actually watched your interview with David Weston as we were just getting a sense of what was happening on January 6, 2021. You talked about, to pick up on your point there, some of your Republican colleagues in the House that day, and you said, quote, "I will look at all of those who vote to look at these challenges when they know there's no factual basis. I will look at them differently," unquote. How do you look at them now?
Well, it's been tough, and I have come to a point where I've reconciled to the point where I can, at least when I was still in Congress until a couple of days ago, I could work with those folks. But I can't deny that I will always look at them in a different light. They hold a little less respect in my eyes than they otherwise would have. They hold less respect than those members of their own party that did vote to certify the election, despite the fact that they were disappointed in the outcome. And even some of those, who went even further and encouraged the insurrection. But I have to admit, I look at them in a different light.
Well, as we continue to keep our eye here on the House floor, a number of states' results have already been read aloud. To this point, there have been no objections. Again, no objections are expected today. No one is contesting these results. But, Congressman, we do realize that the proceedings today happen exactly 2 weeks before Donald Trump will take the oath of office and become the 47th president of the United States. And he has suggested on that first day, 2 weeks from today, he could issue pardons for many, if not all, of those who were convicted of crimes on January 6th, 2021. And I wonder, sir, what your thought is about that.
Well, it's very upsetting to me, both personally, because I was a victim of January 6th. I was one of those members that was trapped in the gallery and couldn't get out until those police officers were able to break through the line and get us out. It's a real slap in the face, I think, to those of us who were there, and we know what we saw and we know what we experienced. It's particularly a slap in the face to the Capitol Police. Above all, the Capitol Police stood strong and defended this institution, defended those of us who worked there against people who came there and did serious physical harm to many police officers. 5 officers lost their lives at the end of it all as a result of the terrible experience that they went through. The idea that the President of the United States would pardon those people who committed a crime against this country because they happen to like him is a really frightening thought. I think it's something that will not go well in the annals of American history. This will be a dark day if he in fact does that.
If you're just joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio, it's the Monday edition of Balance of Power. We're spending time with former Congressman Dan Kildee as lawmakers go about their work of certifying the vote in the 2024 election. This is a live view of a joint session of Congress, the House floor. We've made our way up to Florida, Kaylee, as we work through the states, having unsealed the votes. They are essentially counting and qualifying them. We saw Congressman Brian Stile from Wisconsin, the chair of, there he is now, the administration committee. He and the ranking member are going through the process of making these official with each state. Congressman, as you watch this unfold, do you take heart today? Obviously, 4 years ago was a tragedy and a stain, I think, as we can all agree, on American history. But the fact that it's happening together today, on time, as mandated by the Constitution, with lawmakers working cooperatively, should we be inspired by what we're seeing now as opposed to 4 years ago?
I think we should be inspired and we should be grateful. We should be grateful that the people who we put in office, at least on my side of the aisle, and I'm a former member, but I'm a Democrat and proud of that, that you're not seeing us do the same thing that we saw 4 years ago. And it does beg the question, and I think it's a good question to pose, what if the election had gone the other way? What would today look like if Kamala Harris had succeeded? Would those same representatives on the floor of the House of Representatives now, who are planning to vote to certify the election, how many of them would do what the Democrats are doing and follow the will of the people? I worry about that because, you know, obviously the election went their way. They're pleased. What if it hadn't gone their way? Look at Hakeem Jeffries said it the other day at his address to the House. Loving this country means you love it even when you don't succeed, even when you lose an election. Loyalty to this country is not something that you can pick and choose based on how you think the election should have gone. And I sure hope people have that in mind today as they think about the importance of this moment.
Well, and as you join us here on Balance of Power, sir, as a former member of the House, some of your former colleagues who have also left their positions in elected office looked into the events of January 6th, 2021. I'm thinking of, for example, Liz Cheney, Benny Thompson, Adam Kinzinger. Some of them Donald Trump has suggested should face jail time for the work they did on that committee. And with 2 weeks left to go of his presidency, do you believe Joe Biden should be issuing preemptive pardons to those individuals?
No, I'm not a fan of the use of presidential pardons at all, no matter what they're used for. I think it's authority that is antiquated, obsolete, and should be taken away. I just don't believe it. I have enough faith in the judicial system that if Donald Trump decides to make a mockery of it by pursuing charges against people who simply told the truth and sought the truth, I believe our judicial system, our justice system we have to have enough faith in it that it would find those people innocent. I don't think preemptive pardons are advisable under any circumstance. And even though I would agree with the sentiment, I don't think it would be a good thing to do.
Pretty incredible story in Politico magazine today about Al Gore thanking Mike Pence for his actions of 4 years ago. They met at a Joe Lieberman memorial service over the summer. Congressman Mike Pence told Al Gore that he was inspired by what he had seen in 2001. "I never forgot it," Pence said to Gore, who replied, "You don't know how much that means coming from you." Of course, Al Gore was under a lot of pressure at that point by his own party to defy the Constitution following all the recounts and what was a pretty difficult time, if you're old enough to remember. Shouldn't we also acknowledge the fact that Democratic lawmakers have raised objections in this process that we're witnessing right now in the past? That's a bipartisan exercise, and it's separate from storming the Capitol.
It is. It's separate from storming the Capitol, for sure. But I think there is a clear distinction when an outlier or two within a party, for the purposes of calling attention to an issue, or sometimes to themselves, may have offered objections. But that's a far cry from the majority of a party, members of the House and of the Senate, taking the position that what they know to be a free and fair election should not be certified because they didn't like the outcome. So I've heard those comparisons before, and while they're technically, there have been instances of this, it's a far cry from what we saw on January 6th. And I think it's a distinction with a big difference.
Sir, we're into the M's now in terms of the results, reading out the states. Massachusetts has gone by. That does mean Michigan is going to be coming soon as Kamala Harris stands next to the House Speaker at the rostrum. Michigan, of course, one of the swing states, one of all of the swing states, which she lost. And I wonder, as we look ahead to 2026, to the day we will be experiencing 4 years from now, January 6, 2029, now that you are on the outside kind of looking into people competing for elected office, sir, what do you see as needing to change between now and then so that the next time they read out the results from Michigan, it's the Democrat who won those electoral votes?
Well, I think clearly we need to do a better job of communicating to people in terms they understand, not speak down to people, not speak in wonky policy terms. My advice to Democrats is that if you're having a conversation in a campaign, and if that conversation doesn't fit in a kitchen table discussion, you're having the wrong conversation. And I think sometimes we don't do a good job of getting out of our own way and just speaking to people on terms that they really do understand about the issues that they really care about, not sometimes the big macro issues, but those economic issues that families face. We didn't do a very good job of that. We need to do better, for sure. If we do, then I think the outcome of the election will be determined by that.
The Democrat from Michigan, former Congressman Dan Kildee. We could use you, Congressman, in Washington right now. We need a few folks who know how to handle snow. So let us know when you're back in town. It's good to see you.
You know that here. Thank you.
Yes, you do. Yes, sir, of course. They've been plowing all night, Kaylee. It's still snowing here. There was some concern it was going to interfere with the proceedings, but enough lawmakers stayed in town over the weekend, and certainly Capitol Police stayed in town last evening, that this appears to be going off without a hitch. We just moved through Minnesota here. We could have this wrapped up pretty soon.
Yeah, of course, these proceedings aren't supposed to take an extended amount of time, 4 years ago being the exception to the rule, as it was in so many different ways. But pretty soon here, it will be a remarkable moment as Kamala Harris is going to have to read out the tally, which will illustrate, as if I'm sure it hasn't been hit home enough for her, that she lost by Donald Trump, not by a narrow margin, that he kind of ran away with the Electoral College in November.
Oh, that's for sure. And there we are in Nevada here. Yeah, what must be going through her mind is really something to consider, having seen that video she posted this morning. Kaylee getting people ready for what she talked about, her solemn duty here that she would conduct in front of this joint session. She is sharing the rostrum with the newly elected Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. And by the time this hour is out, we may well have this certified. On to New Hampshire now, as Brian Stile, the congressman from Wisconsin, chair of the Administration Committee, moves through the process and the role that he's playing. Good day to have our signature panel along, isn't it?
It's always a good day to have our signature panel, but especially when we're witnessing history like today.
Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis are with us as we're going to experience this together, remembering they were with Bloomberg 4 years ago as we watched a very different process here. Jeannie, of course, Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick Davis, partner, Stone Court Capital, Republican strategist. Rick, they're moving through the states pretty quickly here, and I suspect that we'll have this done before we are through this hour. What's the takeaway for you as you watch this 4 years later with Kamala Harris standing next to Mike Johnson in the rostrum, and the gears seem to be turning freely?
Well, 4 years ago, we would have never expected Mike Johnson to be Speaker of the House of Representatives, nor Kamala Harris be the candidate for president who just lost to Donald Trump. I mean, it's just amazing the changes that have occurred, not to mention going from an incredibly dangerous and angry mob storming the Capitol to today an incredibly quiet Washington blanketed in snow, going through a pro forma exercise that had been done, 200 times before this, or 145 times before this, and so it's really quite a reflection of the resiliency of the U.S. Electoral system. I mean, regardless of all the charges of democracy being under attack, we have bounced back in a way that by anybody's imagination, our country's stronger today than it was 4 years ago. And there's great promise for its continued leadership around the world, regardless of who wins or loses public office. It's a resilient nation, and we should give it credit every now and then.
Well, and as we consider who won public office this time, whose victory is being certified right now, Jeannie, it's Donald Trump, the very same individual who was contesting his loss 4 years ago and helped inspire the rioters at the Capitol. What does that say about where the American electorate actually is with the events of 4 years ago? To what extent they have really resonated or become a lasting memory at all?
It's so important because I think, when we look at public opinion polls and when we look at the election in November, we see that the events of January 6th do not rate high on the minds of voters in the polls or when they think about Donald Trump's first term in office. In fact, his approval rating is now much higher. It's still not above water, but it's much higher, about 48-49% than it was in January 2021 when it was around 35%. So there is that. The other part of this is that look at how the GOP in Congress has changed since 4 years ago. 4 years ago, 17 members of the Republican Party voted to impeach or remove Donald Trump. Though now 5 of those people remain in office, 2 in the House, 3 in the Senate. We even heard Donald Trump a few weeks ago on Meet the Press saying he would consider charges going after some of those folks from the GOP like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who served on the January 6th committee for doing their duty in Congress. So this is a changed GOP. This is Donald Trump's party. He owns it. It is not the party of 4 years ago. And so, of course, that gives him a lot of cachet. That helped him get Mike Johnson into the speakership on Friday on just one ballot. Wouldn't have happened without him. But that also means that all of those guardrails that helped prevent things, as Rick was just talking about, going much, much further 4 years ago, are now off the table. You know, I was struck by the fact that Betsy DeVos, she resigned from the White House. She resigned her position after the events of January 6th, disgusted as so many people were over what had happened. She is now trying to get back into Donald Trump's good graces down at Mar-a-Lago this very day. So, you know, a lot has changed in Washington. A lot of it helps Donald Trump, and I'm not so sure it helps the American public as it pertains to guardrails to preventing things like this in the future, as he is now going to ascend to the office in just a few days.
That's right. Making our way through the process here as we watch each state being codified with the help of Brian Stile, who was speaking a short time ago, the chair of the admin committee. That, of course, then goes to the rostrum where the vice president and the speaker of the House are standing. This is going to be done, it seems, in pretty good order here, Rick, and it starts bringing up questions about what this Congress is going to deal with next. Donald Trump seeking to answer that question in a Truth Social post that refers to one big bill. This House of Representatives we're looking at, of course, a joint session is about to tackle some serious legislating here in the beginnings of this new Congress. Is it a front-loaded agenda for a reason? You have to get it done now because it only gets harder?
You know, look, I mean, you can make both arguments that by splitting it up, you know, you have more chance of getting something done quickly. An omnibus bill, a universal bill, a big bill may take until the end of the year to get done. And questions are, can you get a big bill through like that? I think we have to really understand, too, you know, normally, you know, these kind of reconciliation bills go through because of some kind of pressure. And the first moment of pressure is going to be funding the government in March. And can you put a big bill together between now and March? Probably not. But that will be your first moment where you have a must-fund, must-pass bill that could be fashioned with some of the Donald Trump mandatory requirements. You know, things like immigration, things like energy, things that he wants to do that won't be as controversial as others. And then, of course, we know that the other big moment in this administration's first year is going to be, you know, the sunsetting of the 17 tax cuts that Donald Trump pass. And that will be something that, again, will be a big moment at the end of the year of this Congress. And so typically only things happen in Congress at big moments. And I think those are the two that stand out. And it kind of begs the point that you're probably going to have two bills. As much as Donald Trump would like, it's highly unlikely to get tax reform, energy, anything on health care, immigration, all done by the time the budget package expires in March.
Well, much sooner than March, it does seem that we are closing out here the reading of the states. As Congressman Brian Stile just read out the results from Vermont, that leaves just Virginia, Washington, West Virginia, Wisconsin, and Wyoming. So just 5 states left to go here, Joe. And remember, these proceedings only began a little bit after the beginning of the 1 o'clock hour.
It looks like this will be wrapped up in about 30 minutes end to end once they're done here. Having seen the House and Senate meet separately at high noon, joint session beginning at 1 p.m., a little bit afterward. And now, of course, the process that we're apparently about to wrap up here. No objections. Nope. To be clear, if you're just joining us here, this certification vote has gone so far, or the count, I should say, without a hitch. We've been moving through the states very quickly. Lawmakers all appear to be in a pretty good mood. It seems like we're picking up right where we left off at the beginning of the new Congress on Friday.
Well, absolutely, as this is one of the first real constitutionally mandated proceedings that they are undertaking after the election of Mike Johnson, the re-election of him as Speaker of the House, as he is seated there at the rostrum next to Vice President Kamala Harris, who we will hear from in just a few moments. And of course, as she reads aloud the final tally, we will bring that to you.
Looks like we're at Washington State now, so we're just about there.
Yep.
Be great to hear the floor for a bit as we approach this magic moment. One that, as we've been making the point here, Kaylee, was pro forma until what happened 4 years ago.
Yep. West Virginia having just been read out. There's just 2 states left to go of the 50.
Madam President,
round of applause as we get closer. Here's Brian
Stile. The state of Wisconsin seems to be regular in form and authentic. And it appears therefrom that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 10 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 10 votes for vice president.
Pleasure for him to deliver his home state, I'm sure, for the president-elect.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Wyoming seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 3 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 3 votes for vice president.
Members of Congress, the certificates having been read, the tellers will ascertain and deliver the result to the President of the Senate.
And of course, we expect this result
The undersigned, Deb Fisher and Amy Klobuchar, tellers on the part of the Senate, and Brian Steele and Joseph Morelle, tellers on the part of the House of Representatives, report the following as the result of the ascertainment and counting of the electoral vote for President and Vice President of the United States for the term beginning on the 20th day of January, 2025.
The state of the vote for the President of the United States, as delivered to the President of the Senate, is as follows. The whole number of the electors appointed to vote for President of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, the majority is 270. The votes for President of the United States are as follows. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 312 votes. Kamala D. Harris Kamala D. Harris of the state of California has received 226 votes.
We've seen each side of the room rise separately for each occasion. Democrats giving Kamala Harris a standing ovation.
The whole number of electors appointed to vote for Vice President of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, a majority is 270. The votes for Vice President of the United States are as follows. J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio has received 312 votes.
And still Senator J.D. Vance is in the chamber for that meeting.
Smiling broadly as his colleagues applaud him.
Tim Walz of the state of Minnesota has received 226 votes. This announcement of the state of the vote by the President of the Senate shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons elected President and Vice President of the United States, each for a term beginning on the 20th day of January 2025, and shall be entered together with the list of the votes on the journals of the House and the Senate. Thank you very much.
There you have it, Vice President Kamala Harris officially presiding over the certification of Donald Trump's presidential election victory and Senator J.D. Vance's election as Vice President of the United States. Remarkable to witness for the first time in 24 years, the loser of a presidential contest having to certify that loss.
Although Mike Pence, of course, had that occasion, it just took a lot longer 4 years ago.
The 119th Congress, the chair declares
They will move on to the rest of the business here.
Dissolved. Thank you.
At the end now of the certification process, that closes the joint session, and a standing ovation from both sides of the aisle here. In a literal sense, they sure made it look a lot easier than some folks feared. There's a massive fence that encircles the Capitol today. Every Capitol police officer on duty, and of course, law enforcement from around the country here to protect this process. Mother Nature may have done more to keep Washington in check with a massive snowstorm that we've had underway here as well. It's a very quiet day, in fact, on Capitol Hill as this happens inside the House.
Well, even half a foot of snow, I guess, is not enough to slow down what was really just half an hour of proceedings for this constitutionally mandated process to see itself to completion, the certification of Donald Trump's election victory with 2 days to go until his inauguration on January 20th. So as we reflect on this moment, let's bring back our signature political panel. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis are still with us. Jeannie, would love to just have your reaction to seeing the vice president who lost to Donald Trump saying firmly on the floor of the House that that indeed happened, that he will be the next president of the United States.
Yeah, it's one of those awkward moments. It's a difficult time, certainly. And as you were talking about, we saw Mike Pence do it. We saw Al Gore do it. We saw Richard Nixon do it. And the Vice President Harris had to do it today. And, you know, the important thing, and I think the thing to celebrate is what she said in her video, that this is her duty. This is the duty of all vice presidents. And she did it, and she deserves credit for that. And this should not be the exception. It should be the rule. And that is the importance of what she's done today.
Rick Davis, from now on, January 6th goes back to being a boring day?
Well, not so boring. I love the pomp and circumstance of our democracy. I think these things are meaningful. It is a lot better when they're not storming the Capitol, when this happens on the inside. And I appreciate everybody's attention to this today. I think it would have been bad if we'd have just sort of kicked the can and said, oh, another ceremonial act that will be put into the record. We got to remember that it's not always been this easy, and yet it's equally important. And I think it's a good thing for teaching our children that if you want a democracy, it's worth fighting for.
Well, here, a snowed-in Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature panel on this 6th of January. 2025. It's great to have both of you with us, and we appreciate the insights. We've gone through a number of live events with Rick and Jeannie Kaylee, and this is just the latest one. They will next be with us, of course, on the 20th of January, the next major live event, I should say. That's the inauguration.
Well, and before we get there on Thursday, of course, we'll have a state funeral for former President Jimmy Carter, also taking place in Washington. One of the other designated special national security events that there has been increased security presence here in Washington for, as we've reiterated repeatedly over the course of the last hour or more. There is a lot of security at the U.S. Capitol, but it has not proved necessary to be utilized as these proceedings went smoothly without a hitch.
Indeed. The 2024 presidential election has been certified by the U.S. Congress. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. Great to have you with us here on the fastest show in politics. We do want to check on Wall Street because it's been a minute as we've kept our eyes, of course, on the proceedings here. Charlie Pellet has the latest on an update on the markets from World Headquarters in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Joe and Kelly. We are looking at a lot of green on the screen right now with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all advancing. And this is the first full trading week of the new year. Here's where we stand. S&P back below 6,000, 59.92, up 50 points right now. We're well off session highs, up 0.8%. The Dow is advancing 117 points, up 0.3%. NASDAQ is up 1.4%, up 277 points. Tech stocks moving higher. NASDAQ 100 index up 1.2%, and the Russell 2000 index higher now by 0.7%. 10-year at 4.62%, with a 2-year 4.26%. Gold lower a little change, down 0.2% right now, 26.36 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.9%, 73.28 a barrel, and Bitcoin just above $102,000. Bitcoin today with a gain of 3.6%. Nvidia shares now up by 4.9%, ahead of a speech tonight by CEO Jensen Huang at the annual CES convention in Las Vegas. The focus will be on any commentary on the Blackwell chip. Again, Nvidia shares up now by 5%. Recapping stocks higher, S&P up 50. That is a gain of 0.8%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much with a look at the debut of the trading week on this January 6th, 2025. Of course, what will go down as a noteworthy day in history, though not for the same reason as 4 years ago. It's just the day that Congress did its constitutional duty and certified the electoral victory of Donald Trump as the 47th president of the United States.
Not a single objection. It was pretty remarkable. We were talking earlier with Dan Kildee about this. It's not unusual to hear objections. In fact, there were many Democratic objections. If you remember, in 2000, 2004, the situation with Ohio, the difference 4 years ago was the attack on the Capitol, what happened outside the Capitol. But today, to see none, no Ds, no Rs, everyone really wanted to make this neat and clean.
Well, and to make a point that this is how the democratic process works in the United States. It's a key pillar of the peaceful transfer of power, that these results are accepted by a joint session of Congress, as they were indeed today. And of course, Democrats not losing the opportunity to make note of the contrast compared to how they view the conduct of their Republican colleagues.
Joe Biden in an op-ed, Kamala Harris in a video. It's an interesting day here in Washington. The contrasts could not be greater from 4 years ago. And as Rick pointed out, it's so quiet on the Hill because we've got a snowstorm. I think maybe one flight got in today, and Mick Mulvaney was on it. I don't know how this is possible, but he's with us at the table right now. The former Republican congressman, co-founder of the Freedom Caucus, former acting chief of staff in the Trump White House. Nice to see you. Happy New Year.
Wait, I still have my Christmas sweater on.
Well, you did pretty well.
No, and I apologize for not dressing appropriately. But yeah, I'm just happy to be here in this weather.
It's a snow day.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not a big snowstorm for most places that are used to snowstorms. But for this town,
it's enough to shut things down.
I think I was the only car on the road in from the airport.
You surprised there was no single objection today?
I was. Let's go back and play some of the audio tape and the videotape of folks of what they've said about Donald Trump over the last 3 or 4 months. I mean, Jamie Raskin, face it, the Democrats were openly accusing him of being the next coming of Adolf Hitler. That if we had voted for him, it would be the end of the democracy as we know it. That's not an exaggeration. That's not me using hyperbole as sort of spinning what the Democrats said about him. That's what they said, and they tried to convince people. I respect the fact that nobody objected. I think that's a good thing. I think Democrats probably decided it was better for their brand long-term not to object. But the next time they go on TV and tell people, oh, this person is the next coming of Adolf Hitler, how are they going to justify what they just did?
Well,
So
because
I think
this
there's
is
an
what the
inconsistency.
electorate voted for. All they did was say, yes, this is how people voted. That's not their vote.
I get that, but don't forget, what did Hillary Clinton say? Oh, remember, Hitler was elected, which he wasn't, by the way. So there's always that, if you really, really thought he was Adolf Hitler, would you vote to certify the election? I think the answer is no. If you really believed it, you would not. And in fact, I wouldn't if I really thought somebody was Adolf Hitler. I wouldn't vote to certify the election. So what I think you've just seen is, look, again, I applaud the way it went down today. It's the smooth transition of power. I'm a huge fan, and I think it was a class move today to do this. But it certainly undermines some of the hyperbole that they were using going into the election.
As we mentioned, we heard from Joe Biden in an op-ed, Kamala Harris in a carefully produced video presentation talking about her solemn duty, both of them going out of their way, though, to remind us of what happened 4 years ago. How should we catalog January 6, 2021? You've got Donald Trump on one side saying it was a day of love, and obviously you saw more than 1,000 people plead guilty to very serious crimes.
And we've talked about it before, and it's sad that, maybe that's not the right word. If you think it was a peaceful protest, there's evidence of that. I mean, I remember seeing it. We've talked about this. I was in town. In fact, I was in the building that morning. I was at my condo in the afternoon, and I saw the people walking through the rotunda, and one person stepped across the velvet ropes, and somebody else grabbed them and pulled them back. So there were absolutely peaceful protesters, and if you want to say it was a peaceful protest, there's some evidence to that. If you want to say it was a violent insurrection, there is certainly evidence to that. My sad, and I will use sad here because I am really sad about this, is that we don't have any sort of common ground over what January 6th was. You've got, if you voted Democrat, you think one way. If you vote Republican, you think another way, at least for most folks. I wish we really knew what happened. And now there's evidence out, or excuse me, there's suggestions out that there were FBI people in the crowd. Is that right? I've heard allegations that the Democrats tampered with the evidence during the January 6th commission. Is that right? We don't know what the facts are. It's really hard to have an informed opinion about something if you don't have the facts.
Well, we do know people lost their lives both on that day and in the
Absolutely.
aftermath. There is video evidence of many of these individuals assaulting police officers. Should those people who are on video, some of whom have already pleaded guilty to these crimes, be pardoned?
That's a great question. Here's how I hope they deal with it. Look, the pardon power is a strange thing that we give to presidents. Why we give it to presidents, I'm not really sure. It's more of a king or queen type of thing. I hope that they go through it case by case. And if they do give pardons to some of the January 6th most violent offenders, let's say, that they look at it and say, okay, in this particular circumstance, let's use the sake of discussion, the jail time doesn't seem to meet the crime. Okay, that would be grounds for a pardon. It would be, people would look at the use of a pardon there and go, okay, that's an orthodox application of the presidential pardon authority. To come in and just say it never happened. It was a peaceful protest. Everybody gets off. I think that would be wrong. It happened. The day absolutely happened, and we have to figure out why it happened, what happened, and then make sure it doesn't happen again. And if you try and sweep it under the rug of history, I think that you're doing a disserce.
I'm sure you remember the way you felt.
Oh, I was angry. Unless I quit.
You resigned over this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm still angry about the day. And if you're American, you should be angry about the day. Even if you're one of the people who thinks it was a peaceful protest, you could look at what you've just talked about, Kaylee, and say, look, but there were other people there who were not, and I'm angry about that. And I think that's not unreasonable.
Do you think we could have seen a repeat of what happened 4 years ago today had Donald Trump not won?
You know, I get asked that question all the time, and I tell people I am the worst person to ask that question of, because I didn't see it coming in the first place. I really didn't, and that's what frightens me the most about that day, is that not only did I not see it coming, if you'd asked me, he said, Mick, if there'd be riots and a transition, I never would have thought it would have been my party, the law and order party, that was involved with it in any fashion. So I am the wrong person to ask about what we might have seen today if the outcome had been different, because I didn't see it 4 years ago.
Then the post-mortem that everyone's walking around the war room talking about stop this deal with Roger Stone, that was not every member of the administration. Otherwise, you would have been exposed to that in advance.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was a minor member of the administration at the time, but yes,
Chief of Staff.
No, not that time.
Okay.
I was Special Envoy to Northern Ireland on January 6th.
Understood.
So yeah, I've been in Northern Ireland for about 6-8 months.
Good. Thank you for reminding us of that.
Otherwise, I would have been involved in a lot more January 6 investigations than I was.
I suspect that's absolutely true. Talk to us about what's happening inside this transition right now, because they're trying to move beyond, obviously, the story that we're describing. And reading the interview today in Axios with Susie Wiles, the whole mantra is no drama this time.
Yes.
Is that possible?
Yes, it is. Is it? Would I bet on it?
Yeah.
No, I think it's. But you asked me if it's possible. It's absolutely possible. What she laid out in her Axios interview is exactly what you would want a chief of staff to lay out. It's textbook. It's absolutely perfect. The question is going to be, can she pull it off, or is somebody? I'll use one of my favorite foils, Peter Navarro, going to go out and start leaking to the press as soon as he doesn't get the answer that he wants in a White House meeting. He did it all the time. We all knew he did it all the time. If the president continues or allows that to happen this time, then it will undermine Susie's ability to run the building in the way she laid out.
Stopping leaks is the key.
Well, it's just hiring people who buy into the fact you're on the team. Okay. John Bolton was never on the team. I'll beat up on Bolton for a second. I mean, John always thought that he was the president. And if Donald Trump decided something that went against what John Bolton thought he should do, John thought it was his duty to try and change that. And if he would go out and leak or do whatever to try and change the president's decision, that undermines the authority of the chief. It undermines the proper operation of a West Wing. So no, if Susie's able to do that, and in order to do that, she has to get the buy-in of Donald Trump. Now, you asked me if it's possible. I said yes. Why? Because it looks like it happened on the campaign. It really did. You have to imagine during that campaign, go back and remember, there were some really high points and some really low points during the 2024 campaign. And if she was able to sort of right the ship and keep things calm, quiet, and buttoned down during the good times and the bad, that's as good an indicator as to what it might be like for her running the West Wing.
In that interview, Susie Wiles also pushed back against the notion that these big accomplishments need to happen in the first 100 days. To summarize her words, she basically thinks that's an arbitrary deadline. But we do have questions about what will happen in the most immediate term when Donald Trump takes office, including how the reconciliation process is going to work, whether it's going to be one big, beautiful, powerful bill or two. This is what the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, had to say about yesterday.
We're 15 days out from the inauguration of President Donald J. Trump for his second term, and we want to make sure that we're jump-starting the agenda now over the next 2 weeks so that he's prepared and ready on day one. President Trump is going to prefer, as he likes to say, one big, beautiful bill. And there's a lot of merit to that because we can put it all together, one big up or down vote, which can save the country, quite literally. Reconciliation is the way to get it done. Why? Because you avoid a 60-vote threshold in the Senate. We're targeting a vote in the House maybe in the first week of April.
So timeline is one thing here, Mick, but just how this gets done is another. Mike Johnson, others in the House have long been advocating for one big bill. Senator John Thune, the majority leader, wants two. Donald Trump, despite advocating for one bill in True Social over the weekend, in an interview with Hugh Hewitt this morning, said he's open to either. So how do you see this going down?
Well, Trump runs the place, right? And he should. He runs the Republican Party. They're in control of the town right now, so he gets to make those decisions. And if I'm Donald Trump, if I'm chief of staff to Donald Trump, why do I care if it's one bill or two? How do I get what I want? How do I get my agenda approved? If you tell me I get a better chance of doing that with one bill, yay, let's do one bill. If it's got to be 16 different bills, I'll do that. The question is going to be this as to whether or not one bill or two. It has to be one of those. It can't be 16 because they only get two shots at the reconciliation apple, right? Two bites at that apple. Do you gain votes by putting a bunch of disparate stuff together, or do you lose votes? Because keep in mind, I don't think they can lose any votes.
Well, and with your knowledge of the House, which do you think the answer is?
I mean, historically in Washington, D.C., the reason you get these massive bills that everybody says they hate is that that's what passes, okay? These omnibus bills. You're really talking about, for lack of a better word, an omnibus reconciliation bill. We're going to do immigration and tax and border and everything else all at one time, right? It's not a single issue bill. I think maybe they look at that and say, you know what? You might be a fiscal conservative and you might not like what the tax does to the deficit, but you really like the other stuff. Sure. And all in all, you'll vote for it. So maybe that's the logic.
Be very curious to see what the Senate parliamentarian thinks of all this when we do the bird bath.
The bird bath.
We'll have you come on to talk about it. But in our remaining moment or two, whatever we have left here, You're the chief of staff. You're the gatekeeper of the White House.
Chief of staff is not the gatekeeper, but keep going. Keep going.
Okay, some people describe it as such. You can give us a reality check on that. Is Elon Musk not the guy you're most concerned about right now because he's got the keys to the Oval Office?
No? I want I want Musk on the team. I mean, he's
being on the team. He's out there freelancing, though, isn't he?
Listen, if I can have one of the smartest people in the world who's aligned with me on many of my priorities, my legislative priorities, that's usually a good thing. Do you have to manage personalities? Yeah, but it's Washington, D.C. You guys know that.
The two biggest personalities maybe in the world.
People say all the time, oh, when will they have their falling out? I don't know if they can afford to have a falling out. I really don't. I think they're both now, they're sort of tied at the hip. Trump can't afford to lose Musk, and Musk can't afford to lose Trump. So I think they're married for the good part. What I think is, the thing that I put back my old OMB hat on, is I want to know when Elon Musk figures out that it's easier to go to Mars than it is to fix Washington. Because that's what he's trying to do with Doge, and I say that only half jokingly. I get you. That is the biggest task. I'm glad that it's getting attention. I'm glad that it's sexy all of a sudden. Everybody wants to talk about Doge. It's been a great marketing standpoint, great marketing campaign. We tried to do it in the first term, failed miserably. That was me. Donald Trump is Elon Musk is a lot smarter than I am, so maybe he can pull it off. But if I'm Trump, I always want Musk on the team. Wow.
All right, Mick Mulvaney, former acting chief of staff in the first Trump White House, former congressman from South Carolina, here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio on a snow day. Thank you so much. We still have more ahead at 5 p.m.
A lot more to talk about. The vote has been certified. Join us at 5 p.m. Eastern on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors that bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, on radio, TV, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg Business Week for this Monday, January 6, 2025. And, you know, remember we were kind of saying the tech trade was so 2024. Well, we've actually had a bit of a rally today, led by some of those big tech names, although I do want to point out we're definitely well off our best levels of the session.
Yeah, we're going to have more in a moment on today's action and the fundamentals behind U.S. equities. Carol, on today's trade, did you check out the semiconductors for some of your gainers a little later in the program?
Nice little deep tease for me. Thank you very much. Because, yeah, that is atop my list of gainers, including the whole index, the SOX. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to get into the reasons why you've seen that sector outperform in a big way. We're also going to get into Donald Trump and his tough talk on tariffs, but maybe no more. There's been a little bit of a debate out there in the news flow today. We're going to get the lowdown on what exactly might come when the president-elect takes over in the White House.
And we're going to talk a little bit about rates, focus on the bond market. Bond traders certainly fixating on a fraught year ahead. We're going to dive into that a little later in the program, too.
You know what New Yorkers are fixating on, Tim, today?
Is it congestion pricing?
Well done.
Everybody's talking about that.
Which one view suggests may actually hold the future of the Democratic Party. It's a great op-ed in the New York Times. We're going to dig into that a little bit later on. First up, though, let's get to that trade. Definitely off our highs of the session, but breaking it down for us is Charlie Bell.
All right, I thank you very much. And here's what's going on. You mentioned the SOX. That is advancing now by 3%. NVIDIA shares up 4.1%, but the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ holding on to gains right to the numbers. S&P up 34 now, up by about 0.6%. We do have the Dow Jones Industrial Average up 30. That is a gain of 0.1%. And NASDAQ up now by 1%. The 10-year, 4.63%, with the 2-year at 4.27%. Spot gold now unchanged on the day, $26.33 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude, $73.38 a barrel, down 0.8%. But another big move in Bitcoin today, up now by 3.3%. Was trading at 102,000, right now at 101,700 on Bitcoin. Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel have jointly filed lawsuits in a last-ditch effort to preserve the planned merger of their companies, which was blocked last week by President Biden. Right now, we've got U.S. Steel up 4.9%. ADRs of Nippon Steel, they're down by 0.2%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Tim Stenovec, Carol Masser, right here on Bloomberg Business Week. Well, we are having a go at perhaps the U.S. presidential campaign versus reality when it comes to U.S. tariffs. President-elect Donald Trump denied a Washington Post report that his aides are considering narrowing his tariff plan so that it would only apply to limited specific critical imports. The Washington Post did report earlier that Trump's aides were discussing applying tariffs to some goods from all countries, but targeting the list of items to those where there are national or economic security concerns. That, according to the story in the Washington Post, they cited 3 people familiar with the discussions, Tim, who it didn't identify.
With more on what our team is hearing and what's expected to be a pivotal part of the president-elect's platform, joining us from Washington, D.C., Bloomberg News politics editor Laura Davison. Laura, he said, they said, he said, he being President-elect Donald Trump, of course, they being the Washington Post, citing sources. Lay out the two sides here and where the conflict is.
Yeah, so what we're seeing here is really kind of a classic sort of a disagreement between Trump and some of his aides. If Trump says, look, I want to do the thing that I said I was going to do on the campaign trail, which is these wide sweeping tariffs on all imports, ranging from, as low as 10% to including, upwards of 60% for imports from China, to his aides now looking at, kind of what that would actually do and what the economic implications are, saying, well, what if we pared that back so it doesn't apply to things like food or school supplies or shoes or a lot of these everyday consumer goods, and just focus on things that have sort of a national security or economic security element, things like different metals or rare earth materials or things that, the industries that Trump wants to bring back to the U.S. And so this is sort of the jockeying that, we're already starting to see and we'll see more of going forward, of sort of these two sides of Trump saying, look, I want to do the big, grand, splashy thing, and his aides being like, well, what if we just pare it back a little bit?
All right, wait a minute. Okay, so this is your world. This is our team's world in D.C., following all of this stuff. I feel like, does this kind of mesh with maybe some of the conversations we've been having from a lot of folks of saying we've got to wait and see until the president-elect is in the White House to see ultimately what plays out in terms of the policies that maybe they'll be scaled back. Is that kind of this happening in real time?
Yes, that's exactly what we're seeing. And, the thing that's so tricky on tariffs in particular is because Trump is really committed to these. He is going to impose some suite of tariffs. We don't know exactly what that'll look like, but it's probably not going to be absolutely everything that he's promised. He also likes to use tariffs as a negotiation tool and say, look, if you, he throws out these ideas. I think we really saw that in the tweets a couple weeks ago about these additional tariffs on Canada and Mexico, as well as on China. And these are sort of kind of his opening bid and to get to whatever his end goal is. So we're going to see tariffs. We just don't know what, and that's going to be the chaos in the next several weeks.
Laura, are we being managed? I'm thinking about the 3 identified people or the unidentified people in the Washington Post story. Are there members of the Trump team kind of floating some things out to see how the markets respond, how the media responds, kind of getting an idea of, okay, so if we roll it back a little bit, let's see how everybody feels about this before we actually maybe do it. What do we know about what's going on behind the scenes? Yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly something we saw really play out in the first Trump term, even more so. The campaign was a lot better at not allowing leaks, as they didn't have, Susie Wiles, she runs a pretty tight ship. But now as the rubber is really meeting the road and some of these stakes are becoming clear, some of these ideas could become law or become, executive orders in just a couple of weeks. This is where you see people start to say, oh no, we actually need to come up with a plan here that needs to be on paper, and let's just fly a trial balloon. And we saw markets react really quickly in a positive way when this report came out, and then reverse those gains after Trump said no, fake news, I'm not actually scaling back my tariff plan.
Well, we know in the first term who opposed these tariffs, and sort of the old school Wall Street folks who don't necessarily see eye to eye with the president-elect when it comes to these tariffs. Where is daylight now with teams of folks he's announced, people who if they are confirmed, will take posts in the administration? What do we know about where they stand versus where the president stands? Is everybody on his side now?
Everyone, at least in the administration, is publicly supportive of tariffs of some level. The thing is, there's a really broad universe here. So you have folks like Kevin Hassett, who will lead the National Economic Council, Scott Bessent, who will be at Treasury, who are seen as kind of more on the free trade side. They still are supportive of tariffs and know that tariffs are going to be part of the agenda, but they're not pushing for the biggest, most maximalist tariff strategy. People like Peter Navarro, who will be in the White House in a trade-focused position, are more on the let's go big and let's do everything we can. Navarro's seen as having a little bit less influence overall the economic policy compared to Hassett and Scott Bessent, but a lot of these things, really determine on who was the last person Trump talked to, what does Elon Musk come out and say in a tweet? There's a lot of different factors on what actually happens, getting across the finish line.
All right, so I don't know, you guys come back from the weekend, this is all happening. How are you thinking about it in the newsroom and the team? Is it just kind of, I don't know, we're starting to just kind of figure out maybe ultimately what policy will be once Donald Trump takes the White House?
Yeah, and we're really thinking about, what are sort of these power struggles that are cropping up? We saw another example of this over the weekend where Trump came out and said he wanted one big, beautiful reconciliation bill. And basically the reconciliation process is what Republicans in the House and Senate will be able to use to pass all the majorities to not rely on Democrats. There's been a bunch of debate for weeks. It was unclear where Trump stood. And then he came out and said, look, this is the plan. This is what we're doing. There's going to be a lot of sort of behind the scenes machinations. Trump will come out and say something publicly, and then the staff will again go to work to incorporate whatever these, decrees he makes by tweet. And, we sort of moved away from that during the 4 Biden years, but that is about to be our new reality here post January 20th.
Yeah, well, considering, and we've had this discussion before, but considering how close we are to the president-elect taking office just in a couple of weeks, I do wonder about the way that the market could be a check on what he wants to do, given that he does watch the stock market so closely. What are you hearing about that, Laura? Will he take into account the market reaction to help shape his policy?
He will to some extent. You know, the market is really important to him. You hear him talk in his public statements about how much he cares about the market. It's an indicator that he looks at. And so he's going to be, you know, some of the arguments he makes, particularly on tariffs, of, oh, the market just doesn't understand. But if the markets continue to suffer, you know, weeks and months as a result of some of these tariff policies, that's when you could start to see him kind of, you know, make different changes. He also, at the same time as these tariffs are going to be coming online, they're also going to be negotiating a tax package. So that's, I think, a little bit unclear to everyone about how the market is going to interpret these two things of, you know, potentially more corporate tax cuts or more other business-friendly tax cuts paired with tariffs. You're going to have a lot of people in you know, corporate offices who are trying to like model out what this actually means for them.
Hey, listen, while we have you, just one last question. Donald Trump asked a New York judge to delay his hush money sentencing set for January 10th so that the president-elect can essentially challenge his guilty verdict in the case ahead of his inauguration. Safe to say this was expected. Does this likely mean we will not see a Donald Trump before his sentencing hearing on January 10th?
There's the potential of that. However, the sentencing hearing has really been pared back. Trump can't attend it virtually. You know, he's already been assured there's no jail time associated with the sentence. So he would be sort of a symbolic victory if he got it delayed, but ultimately doesn't mean much for, you know, his taking office in a couple weeks.
All right, going to leave it on that note. Hey, Laura, thank you so much. Bloomberg News politics editor Laura Davison joining us with the latest from D.C. Now, as we said, there was definitely some market reaction when it came to the overall trade. Also, what happened with the U.S. dollar based on possible developments around Trump tariffs. So we're keeping an eye on that, and we're really keeping an eye on the overall market trade. Not as enthusiastic or not as bullish, certainly on the equity side, as it was earlier, Tim.
Still seeing the NASDAQ Composite up by a full percentage point, the S&P 500 up half a percentage point, the Dow just up fractionally right now. Names like NVIDIA, though, other semiconductor names, they're certainly surging higher. Engaged to the Mag 7 mega caps, climbing at one point today more than 2%. We wanted to know more about the trends, the patterns, the fundamentals, so we had to check in with Bloomberg Intelligence Director of Equity Strategy and Chief Equity Strategist.
We wanted to know everything.
Gina Martin-Adams. She's here in the studio. So, Gina, I know you like to look at the big picture, but we got to ask you about today's reaction, because as Carol started the program saying, wait a second, we thought the big tech trade was a trade of 2024, but here we have 2025, off to a pretty big start for the Mag 7. How are you seeing things?
Yeah, I mean, as you correctly identify, one day does not make a trend, but nonetheless, I think we have seen kind of a distribution of this trade emerge since the second half of 2024. Something really critical happened in the middle of 2024, and that was we passed a peak earnings momentum for this group. And as a result, you've seen some of the stocks perform okay, some of the stocks perform less well, and we've definitely seen a breakup of that trade at the very least. We've also seen some loss of leadership for tech broadly, where other groups like financials and industrials started to gather a little bit of a bid in the second half of 2024. But it's been a give and take. Investors right now are clearly concerned about one big thing, and that is monetary policy is maybe not going to be as supportive as it was supposed to be. That's taken a little bit of the wind out of the sails of the cyclical trade and pushed capital back toward tech, but I don't know how temporary that is in an environment in which earnings momentum is actually decelerating for this group. That was the big key in 2023 and 2024, at least in the first half. Earnings momentum for this group was so much stronger than the rest of the market. It was printing greater and greater earnings growth quarter after quarter after quarter. Now we're seeing decelerating earnings growth quarter after quarter after quarter, and that creates a different investing landscape for this community.
I want to ask about some research you had over the weekend. The headline says record gap in stocks is an eerie reminder of the tech bubble collapse of 2000.
You said this to our whole show this morning.
Thank you, Carol.
You're very welcome. Great research, because I do feel like we keep making this comparison. I mean, it does catch our attention. Is it fair to make that comparison?
In some ways it's not. This is one data point, right? And what we're pointing out here is that in the fourth quarter, you had a really interesting anomaly that hasn't occurred very often. When we look back more than 20 years, we find only 14 instances in which stocks rose in a quarter globally. The market rose, but the median equity was down. And the divergence between those two in the fourth quarter was at a new record high. Now, interestingly,
not a healthy thing, right?
No, not necessarily a healthy thing. Doesn't necessarily a huge harbinger of doom, but it doesn't happen very often. And the other points in time in which it happened were pretty ominous dates, like 2000, 1998. It also happened in the second quarter of last year. Again, one of those moments in which we saw some pretty big distribution emerge in the equity market in the third quarter. We saw a 10% correction. We kind of forget about it. But we did see a pretty big disruption emerge in the third quarter. It does set up the market for an enhanced degree of risk, because it does say that our gains are still extremely concentrated in a small subset of companies. And that means that it's on those companies to keep helping to power gains forward, or it's on the rest of the market to start to pick up some of the slack here.
I'm going to say a phrase that's probably among the most dangerous phrases to say when I'm talking to Gina Martin Adams. But
don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it.
Is this
taking
time?
Your chances
Is this time different?
You know, it could be. This is again one data point. You know, there's one big difference that I could point out between today and the year 2000 from a fundamental perspective. In the year 2000, we weren't getting the earnings growth at all.
I thought you were going to say profits.
To back up price performance.
Yeah.
We're getting great earnings growth out of this group. We're just losing momentum on that earnings growth. It's still
growing,
going
but
to push through extremely strong earnings.
Yeah.
But not as strong as last year, and we think that could be somewhat meaningful.
What about the rest of the market? Ignore Mag 7.
Yeah.
Where are we fundamentally? What are earnings expectations? What are valuations?
Yeah, it's very interesting because we're just starting to get our sea legs in the rest of the market. It has been such an interesting market over the last 2 years, where 2023 and the first half of 2024 was really all about tech and communication stocks. And beyond that, mostly about the Mag 7, really kind of picking up the whole market by its bootstraps and moving on. And the rest of the market was just not participating. We saw that change with the third quarter earnings season.
Yeah.
We started to see some improvements in earnings growth, but it's very scant. We're talking low single-digit aggregate earnings growth with still some very, very significant weaknesses in the energy and materials space dragging on earnings. So you're at this point in time where
it doesn't feel good.
It doesn't feel great. There's not a lot to kind of hang your hat on, if you will, with respect to the earnings outlook, because we didn't get enough Fed easing to really push that cycle growth going forward for the cyclical industries.
Right.
We're also experiencing decelerating earnings momentum for the tech groups. That's leaving investors kind of grasping at straws for investable opportunities.
Outside of tech, I know this is something you and the team have been looking at a lot over the last year or two. Productivity gains as a result of AI in companies that are not AI companies.
Yes.
What are we seeing?
Not